All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Chuck Spence. I'm the director of the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, and PTAC is pleased to welcome our clients and others who may be joining us for this Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification workshop. We are pleased to offer this to all of you. I presume that many of you are prime contractors or subcontractors to the Department of Defense. And as you know, that the CMMC certification is going to be the certification that the Department of Defense will require with their supply chain as they try to increase the security of that going forward. I'd first like to begin by explaining what PTAC's role in this as defined by one of our bosses, the Department of Defense. As you know, PTAC has a cooperative agreement with the Defense Logistics Agency, a division with DoD, and of course with our host here in Utah, which is the Governor's Office of Economic Development. But I'd like to just define this for you so that you know what PTAC's role in cybersecurity is with our clients and what our role will be going forward. So I'll just read this if I might. The Department of Defense plans for PTACs to assist, guide, and direct businesses through an accreditation body to become CMMC certified. The plan is for PTACs to take the same training provided by the accreditation bodies as cybersecurity third-party assessment organizations, but not take the actual certification test. Nor will PTACs become certified or registered practitioners or become this cybersecurity third-party assessment organizations. Nevertheless, we are tasked by DoD to, as I said, to assist, guide, and direct businesses to this accreditation body. This training for PTACs will probably take place sometime in the spring of 2021, so it's still down the road here 4 or 5 months. But in the meantime, I've asked one of our PTAC regional managers, Tom Gerke, who offices out of Utah County, and he covers Utah County, Juab, and Wasatch. And I've asked Tom to be PTAC's CMMC expert, and he will be the point person for all things CMMC. In the way of housekeeping, what we're going to do today, again, this is a 4-hour training from obviously from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to have breaks about every hour. I'd like for you to give permission to ask questions during Adam's presentation, but I would like to ask that you submit those questions through the chat box there. And then our administrative support person, Joshua Wiggins, will play the monitor, and he'll feed those questions to Tom. So, again, we welcome everyone to this PTAC-sponsored workshop. And today we have Adam Austin from Totem Tech. Adam is the lead cybersecurity engineer for Totem. He has over 10 years of experience securing classified information in U.S. government IT systems. He holds a master's degree in information assurance and is a certified information security manager and a certified information systems auditor. And Adam will be leading the discussion today. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Adam Austin.
All right. Thank you very much, Chuck. And thank you, Joshua. And thanks to the Utah PTAC for the opportunity to present to you all today. As Chuck mentioned, we'll take the full 4 hours with a break every hour or so, and this will be a lot of information coming at you, but we'll break it down into manageable chunks. And I would encourage questions at any time. I would ask that you submit those questions into the Zoom chat module, and Josh will curate those, and he'll feel free to interject in whenever a question is timely and relevant for what we're talking about. So this is a workshop. It's intended to be as hands-on for you all as we can get it through this virtual environment. And we have lots of goodies, lots of materials for you all to work on, either as I work on them in the workshop or afterwards. And so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat for you all to go download all the materials that I'll be going through in the workshop today. So it's a link to a share file website. You can click on that link and download the materials. So I'd encourage you to do that at some point during the workshop so you can follow along in some of these tools that we'll be using. We'll be introducing you to several different tools that we actually use ourselves for our clients at Totem Technology. As you can see on this very first cover slide, we have at least 6 acronyms. Cybersecurity is acronym heavy. I promise I will expand all of those acronyms and explain them in due course through this workshop. If I forget to expand one of those acronyms, please just remind me in the chat, and I'll make sure I circle back and explain all them. But what we're going to be talking about today are the current regulatory environment for Department of Defense contractors that process certain types of unclassified DoD-related information. We'll be talking about the current regulatory regime, as well as the coming regulatory regime, the CMMC. Chuck mentioned it's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. But first thing we need to do is talk about why we're all here and why there is a regulatory cybersecurity compliance process in the first place. So I'm going to start us off with what I think is a pretty visceral example of why we're here. And by the way, you may hear occasionally a cynical tone from me about the CMMC process. It's turning into a little bit of a behemoth in my opinion, but some sort of regulation on us as DoD contractors is necessary. And like I said, this is a pretty visceral example of why. So on the bottom of this slide here, you see so United States and some of our allies, our current 5th generation multi-role airborne weapon system, the F-35 Lightning II. The prime contractor on for this weapon system is Lockheed Martin, but Lockheed Martin's supply chain for building this weapon system is thousands, maybe tens of thousands deep. So thousands of subcontractors and vendors that supply parts and know-how to build this latest 5th generation weapon system, airborne weapon system. At the top, you see the Chinese knockoff copycat version of this same weapon system, the J-31. There are some differences. For instance, the F-35 has 1 engine, where the J-31 has 2 engines. But in general, you should be able to see many more similarities than differences between these two aircraft, especially in this forward sweep of the air intake. That's a very unusual feature for jets, and both of these jets have that same feature. And the Chinese have showed the J-31 they've showed it off at some air shows, and from all that we can see, it has the same or very similar capabilities to the F-35. And that's not a coincidence. The Chinese stole the information about how to design, build, and operate the F-35 and use that stolen information to create a copycat, the J-31. And they stole this information not just through good old-fashioned boots-on-ground spy work, and they didn't just steal classified secret and top secret information from the prime contractor. They stole unclassified information from many members of us in the supply chain, the DoD supply chain. And in aggregate, little bits of stolen unclassified information compiled and aggregated, that we see what the end result can be of those types of thefts. And they one of their primary methods of theft was and is cybersecurity theft. So stealing information through networks. And one of the real kickers of this whole outcome is that the Chinese can produce the J-31 for an order of magnitude cheaper than we can produce the F-35. So the J-31 cost them around $10 million to produce. The F-35 costs us around $100 million to produce. It's way cheaper for them because they didn't have to expend all of the decades of research and development. Nor did they have to spend time discovering how to efficiently manufacture parts. So they're not only stealing designs for the F-35, they're stealing information on how we, Department of Defense manufacturers in the Department of Defense supply chain, set up efficient assembly lines, or our mixtures for efficient and novel carbon fiber parts, or maybe even CNC code for how to machine various parts that go into the F-35. So the Department of Defense recognizes that this theft in general of information represents a very high risk to its mission, and that we've lost our military competitive advantage. And so and part of this theft comes from this unclassified information that we all as defense contractors process. And so they have to do something about it. They've in 2016, they started putting out more robust regulations for how we handle unclassified information. And then with the coming CMMC, which we'll talk about in depth, it'll no longer be a process of self-assessment and self-certification that we're following these rules. We're going to be taken to task, and we're going to need to apply for a certification and to have an independent, objective assessment of our current cybersecurity programs.
Hey, Adam, I've got a question. Are all
Yep.
government contractors required to have these certifications, or what is the nature of the classified information? One contractor says they don't have or transmit anything that would be considered classified because they just do waste and recycling.
Yeah, so it's not classified information. It's a type of information called uncontrolled, unclassified information. We'll get to that question in a second, or the answer to that question, the in-depth answer to that question in a second. But the brief upfront general answer is yes. All members of the DoD supply chain, no matter how far you are down in the supply chain for a given prime contractor, you will have to have some sort of CMMC certification. This includes waste collectors. This includes the lawn maintenance folks that mow the lawn at the Pentagon, because we all process some sort of federal government related information as part of executing a contract. But I promise I'll delineate between various types of unclassified information and the types of certifications here in just a bit. All right, so I hope you agree with me that's a pretty visceral example of the fact that we have to do something. Totem Technology is just a brief introduction to us. We're actually a spin-off, a daughter company of a U.S. Air Force prime contractor called Haight Bay and Associates, and you'll see my contact information reflects both companies. Haight Bay and Associates was formed in 2014. We're a small business. In fact, we're a micro business. We're fewer than 20 employees, yet we're a prime contractor for a logistics program for the U.S. Air Force. Having understood the regulations for us processing controlled unclassified information that were levied upon us starting in 2016, we've been in this cybersecurity compliance journey ourselves for 5 years now, and we recognize that we have a good deal of experience and expertise in this field, and so we offer that expertise to our partners like PTAC and their clients. We are a small business, so we understand how small businesses are resource strapped. So we like to say that we are training our clients or empowering them to manage a cybersecurity program themselves as much as possible. So we strongly emphasize training before technology, and then when it comes to technology, which is a necessary part of cybersecurity, we emphasize free and open source technology options where possible. Chuck gave the introduction of myself, so I won't belabor that point, but I have been doing this for over 10 years, and hope to share some of that experience with you today. The agenda for the workshop. we have sort of 5 topics that we're going to discuss. An overview of the requirements, we'll start with that, and that's where we'll get into the delineation between regular old federal contract information and the controlled unclassified stuff that requires higher protection. Ultimately, we're all going to have some sort of cybersecurity program, and the blueprints, so to speak, for that program come in the form of something we call a system security plan, SSP. So we'll talk about how to scope the SSP. So how to determine what aspects of your organization should be included in your cybersecurity program. The CMMC is coming. It has not been fully vetted and released yet, but nevertheless, there is a current compliance requirement for those of us that process controlled unclassified information. We call it the DoD 800-171 assessment methodology, and so we'll lead you through, in the 3rd topic, we'll lead you through how to perform a self-assessment, which is required for those of us with certain DFARS clauses in our contract. Then we'll jump into the building those blueprints for your cybersecurity program, the SSP, and we'll introduce you to the basics of what constitutes a good cybersecurity policy, which is a statement that dictates expected outcomes for certain safeguards in your environment, and then also describes technology, processes, and procedures that help enforce those policies. So those 2 policy statements and descriptions of technology go together to form your cybersecurity plan. And we'll give you tools to help build your SSP and perform the assessment methodology. We'll also, in the last topic, we'll talk about another requirement of us as DoD contractors, and that is to be able to identify cybersecurity incidents and then report those incidents to the Department of Defense. And no matter where you are in the supply chain, you have a requirement. If you process controlled unclassified information, you have a requirement to report recognized incidents to the DoD directly, not to your prime contractor, but actually directly to the DoD. And we'll give you, if you don't have one yet, we'll give you an incident response plan template that we've come up with in conjunction with our partners at GuardSite, which is our managed security service provider out of Cedar City, Utah. They've generously licensed their incident response plan template, and we'll take you through that. Okay, so let's start with an overview of all of the regulations and the current compliance regime and the expected future compliance regime. And I'm going to start you off immediately with an eye chart slide, a very busy slide. I promise all these slides aren't like this, but I really like this particular graphic because it shows all of the regulations in one place. And if you download this PowerPoint, everything that has an underline or all the text that's underlined, you can actually click on and drill right down or open up the web page with the regulation or standard. So right at the beginning, we need to delineate between 2 types of information that we, Department of Defense contractors, may process as part of executing our contract. At the top right, FCI. This is federal contract information. Any information that is generated by or for a federal government contract that you would not publish publicly. So you wouldn't publish this information on your web page. You wouldn't put it on LinkedIn, on Instagram. Any of that type of information is considered federal contract information and is subject to some basic cybersecurity protections, which means anybody in the Department of Defense that does anything on a DoD contract processes some sort of FCI, federal contract information. So invoicing, purchase orders, those types of documents are considered FCI. So even your landscapers, even your waste management folks have some sort of cybersecurity responsibility to protect that electronic information. The safeguards that you're required to implement are called out in the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation, Clause 52-204-21, and there are actually 17 basic protections that you have to put in place. We won't get all the way in the weeds today with all of those 17, but we'll touch on the basics of them. Okay. Now, if you think about a Venn diagram, a big circle that is the FCI, a subset of FCI will be explicitly deemed by the Department of Defense as requiring additional protection because it's of a more sensitive nature. That more sensitive information is considered controlled unclassified information, CUI. And there was an executive order under the Obama administration that required the National Archives and Record Administration, NARA, to develop a program and policy for handling and marking CUI. And each individual agency in the federal government was required to adopt that NARA policy. The DoD has adopted the NARA CUI policy through their Department of Defense Instruction 5200.48. And they adopted this policy in March of 2020. I'm going to come back to this document. If there's nothing else you take away from this workshop, take away the knowledge that DODI 5200.48 exists, and you should download this document, read it, and memorize certain parts of it. And I'll tell you which parts are most important for us as contractors here in a bit. But we mentioned that CUI, which is a subset of FCI, requires some additional protections. The Department of Defense describes what the expectations are for those protections in the DFARS, which is the Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. So it's sort of a daughter document to the FAR. And DFARS Clause 204, 252, 7012, sorry, 252, 204, 7012, which I'll call DFARS 7012, requires of us contractors that process, store, transmit CUI. It requires us to provide, quote unquote, adequate security to protect that CUI. And it also requires that we have an incident response and reporting capability. The adequate security that we're expected to put in place, the safeguarding measures that we're expected to implement are listed in a NIST, that's National Institutes of Standards and Technology, Special Publication 800-171. So this is a standard from NIST under the Department of Commerce, a list of several, actually over 100, 110 in fact, safeguards that we have to put in place to protect CUI. And these safeguards are both policy related as well as technology related. Ultimately, what it all boils down to and what our immediate requirements are for those of us that process, store, transmit CUI. To be compliant right now under the current regime, we're required to have a system security plan in place, so develop a system security plan and begin to implement it. For the aspects of the system security plan that we do not have fully implemented, we're required to generate a gap remediation or a plan to fix those weaknesses, a plan to fully implement all of the requirements. And that plan is called a Plan of Action and Milestones, POAM. And then we're also required to have an incident response plan and have exercised that plan and have tested our capability to report cybersecurity incidents that are involve CUI, report those incidents to the Department of Defense. All right, so how is the Department of Defense holding us accountable for doing all of this stuff, especially with CUI? They have a current assessment methodology, what they call the DoD Strategic Assessment Methodology, which is a scoring system which assigns a certain value to the full implementation of each of the 110 safeguards listed in the 800-171 document. And we're expected to assess ourselves against this scoring methodology and report that score through an online portal to the DoD. And being able to report the score actually requires that we have a certain type of electronic file called a certificate that's issued from the Department of Defense, and that we as a contractor possess and use that certificate as a set of credentials to log into a website. And that certificate is not free. You actually have to purchase this. I'll take you through that later in the workshop. So this is the current assessment methodology. I'll get to it in a little bit, but the DoD has actually placed additional emphasis on this assessment methodology because their planned replacement or superseder to this methodology, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, the CMMC, has been delayed. CMMC was already supposed to have been written into contracts starting in around Q2, Q3 of this year, calendar year, but that's been delayed. It's looking like it's not going to happen in contracts until Q1, Q2, and I'll dive into this a little bit more in a bit. So when CMMC does come online, though, it will be a license to operate with the Department of Defense, a license to be able to execute contracts. You will have to have a CMMC cert at all levels. All 350,000 plus of us that are in the DoD supply chain will have to have some kind of certification. Okay. Yeah, I'll circle back to the DoDI 5248 in a second. All right. CUI, controlled unclassified information, is the fact that you possess it or process it or store it or transmit it. That fact will be communicated to you in contractual language, either directly from the Department of Defense or flowed down to you through a prime contractor. Until that is communicated to you, and the communication can come in the form of simply calling out the DFARS 7012 clause in a contract, or it can come in the form of a prime contractor working through a tool like ExoStar. So some of you are familiar with the ExoStar portal, and telling you through that supply chain management tool that yes, you're expected to protect CUI. If you don't have that type of contractual language identifying that you store, process, transmit CUI, then you still have requirements, because you still execute some aspect of a DoD contract, and you still process, store, transmit some sort of federal contract information. And so you must implement 17 basic cybersecurity safeguards. These are called out in FAR Clause 52.204.21, as I mentioned. There's a link to it there. By the way, all 17 of these basic safeguards are also rolled into NIST 800-171. So of the 110 requirements in 800-171, 17 of those are these basic safeguards. And when the CMMC is fully introduced, fully incorporated into contracts, the CMMC level 1 will be comprised of these 17 basic safeguards. Okay, so let's switch and talk about CUI. The DFARS, the supplement to the FAR, defines something called a covered contractor information system. And it's an IT system that we as a contractor own, operate, manage internally to process our corporate information. If we process, store, or transmit what's called covered defense information, CDI, from that system, then our system is covered, and we have to implement certain protections to protect the information, the system itself and the information, excuse me. So in our Venn diagram here on the right-hand side, we all process FCI of some sort. Some of us may be informed through contractual language that we also process CUI, or some of that FCI is considered CUI. And if it's related to a Department of Defense contract, it's considered CDI. Under CDI, there are 4 types of defense-related CUI. 2 of those types are related to nuclear information, nuclear propulsion, and general nuclear information. A third is related to critical infrastructure information. So those of us that might work on contracts that provide electrical service to a Marine Corps base, or process drinking water for the Navy, or provide internet services to the Air Force. That's critical infrastructure information. Most of us, though, especially those of us in the manufacturing environment, are going to process, store, transmit what's called CTI, controlled technical information. And there's some examples, some very generic examples of CTI listed here in these bullets. So research and engineering data that's related to a Department of Defense contract. Engineering drawings of all types. So if you're an engineering shop, you run CAD software, and the output from that CAD computer-aided design software are drawings of stuff that goes into military products. So you build a valve that goes into the engine in a missile. That's the drawings for that are probably going to be considered CTI and therefore CUI. All right, standards, manuals, technical reports, technical orders, software source code, studies and analysis and related information. We have a client that does soil sampling and soil testing for the US Navy. The results of those soil tests have been considered CTI in the past. In general, any contract deliverable requirements list item, especially those items that require you to put distribution statements on them, it's a pretty good bet that stuff is going to be considered CUI, and you're going to have to put these extra protections in place.
Hey,
So most, Josh, go ahead.
Which DFARS clauses was that previous chart referring to? Yeah,
this slide.
One.
Yep, this is referring to DFARS clause 204, 252, sorry, 252, 204, 7012. I'll type that in the chat. You can find links to it from this page right here.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Great question. Lots of acronyms, lots of FAR clauses going on here, but yeah, it's probably better just to link to from the slide. So if you download the slides, you can link to it. Come on, there we go. All right. What are the implications for us? All DoD contractors process, store, transmit some sort of FCI. Many of us are also going to be considered covered in that we process, store, transmit CUI. Maybe even most. It's not clear yet. The DoD has done is behind in its identification and specification of exactly what elements it does consider CUI. I'll touch on that again here in a bit. But if you process in general any of those types of controlled technical information in the bulleted list on the previous slide, you better be preparing your organization to meet all of the requirements to protect CUI. So again, a couple more examples, or just reiteration of examples: Seadrils, CAD systems, Microsoft Office systems that are used to develop tech manuals. These are some examples. It also includes cloud-based IT systems. So at a minimum, if you use a cloud-based tool like Microsoft 365, many of us use Office 365. It needs to have FedRAMP ATO. So FedRAMP is the Federal Risk Assessment Management Program. It's the clearinghouse that the federal government operates to inspect and vet services that cloud service providers are attempting to sell to the federal government. So it needs to have FedRAMP approval at the moderate level or above or equivalent. And that's no small feat to get approval to operate in the FedRAMP paradigm. I was just doing some metrics yesterday. The FedRAMP moderate level requires of a cloud service provider over 1,700 individual actions that they have to do to secure their cloud service. So it's not your fly-by-night cloud service providers that you're going to be able to use to process, store, transmit CUI. There's some work that you have to do as a contractor to ensure that they are prepared to meet the DoD requirements to protect this information. But the good news is you should be able to shrink the footprint of your IT system that you use to store, process, transmit this information to as small as possible, and eliminate aspects of your operations or IT system that aren't used at all to process this information. And you may not have to secure those systems. So an example of an aspect of an IT system. And by the way, let me define system. So the system are all of your hardware components, the software that runs on those components, the network devices that support the network that connect these components, the people that use those components, and the processes and procedures that dictate how they use those components. When we say system, we're talking about IT system, we're talking about all of that stuff. So if your organization uses the G Suite, so Google Drive, Gmail, but it's only used for corporate communications and you do not pass CUI, controlled unclassified information, across the G Suite of tools, then that would not be considered part of your covered IT system. So one of your initial tasks, and we'll talk about this process today, one of the initial tasks for your organization, if you believe you process CUI, is to determine exactly what components of the system touch that CUI. A little bit of re-emphasis on what you must be doing right now. So the DFARS clause, here's another link to it, 252, 204, 7012, requires two overarching high-level requirements. One, that we provide and implement adequate security for the CUI that we process. This was the date by which we were supposed to all have this adequate security in place is now almost 3 years behind us. Okay, the DoD recognizes that a very small percentage of its supply chain actually met this date, and they did not have any way to hold us accountable for not meeting that date, or the mechanisms that they had for holding us accountable were not effective. Therefore, the CMMC, they're going to be rolling out the CMMC as the accountability mechanism for us to apply adequate security. And then we must have the ability to recognize and report cyber incidents. And you do that, you report the cyber incident through a portal that the DoD operates, and you have to have a medium assurance certificate, so an electronic file or a CAT card to access this portal. And I'll be taking you through this process more in depth in the incident response topic later on today. Okay. Adequate security for CUI comes in the form of currently of implementing the NIST SP 800-171 set of controls. And so we use the terms controls, safeguards, cybersecurity requirements, best practices. We use all those terms interchangeably. All right, so when I say the word control, you can think of a good practice to be doing to secure information. 800-171 calls out 110 individual safeguards that we must implement. They're grouped into 14 families of related controls. And these extrapolate out into 320 assessment objectives, and that's what NIST calls them. They're the things that the assessors are going to assess us on. And Totem Technologies' perspective is that, well, if the assessor is going to ask us about these 320 things, then we better do all 320 things. So we call these organizational actions. So ultimately, there are 320 individual line items to address in your system security plan to fully implement 800-171 and provide adequate security for this CUI. So what do you need to do? What's the sequence of steps that you as a DoD contractor that process CDI, which is a subset of CUI, what do you need to do? You need to gather whatever kind of existing cybersecurity policies, plans, procedures that you have in place. A good example of a type of policy that you might already have in place is like an employee handbook or an employee acceptable use policy. That's a really great resource to draw from to begin fleshing out and developing your system security plan. So acceptable use policy is the set of standards that you expect your employees and personnel to abide by when they use a computer IT resource. So gather what you have. Perform a gap assessment against the expectations for what you're supposed to have that are listed in 800-171. We'll teach you how to do this in the next section of this workshop. And we'll give you a tool to help. And then you need to modify the SSP accordingly, or if you don't have anything, you need to develop one. There are some tools out there to help you develop an SSP, and at Totem Technologies, that's really our bread and butter. That's what we help our clients do, is develop their SSP and give them recommendations for how to implement. So by developing an SSP, you're developing new policies, processes, and you're documenting everything. Part of the CMMC, it's a cybersecurity maturity model. And one aspect of maturity is that the organization has documented all of its processes and procedures and expectations. Okay, and also documented how it plans to resource or provide resources to implement the cybersecurity program. Some of these controls in 800-171 may be not applicable for your organization. Even your not applicable controls, you need to document justification for why the organization feels that they're not applicable. It's not enough just to do hand waving and say, no, we don't have to do that. You have to tell the assessor why you don't have to do that. Then you need to develop and implement a capability to report cyber incidents. So in other words, you need to have an incident response plan and an incident response capability and the ability to report incidents to the DoD. Any of these SSP actions that aren't fully implemented represent a weakness in your cybersecurity program and a non-compliance in the assessment regime. And so you need to also have a plan of action and milestones to fix those gaps. Corrective action plan. And then this is a mature, CMMC is a maturity model. So it's not a fire and forget process. It's not a check the box checklist process. There will need to be some sort of continuous monitoring. So an organizational wide continuous monitoring process by which all of this, the implementation of all of these controls is periodically assessed for effectiveness. And if it's deemed that it's not effective, if the control is not working properly, then we need to fix that. It's a risk to the organization and we need to fix that. So it's a lot to do. Seems like a lot to do, I know. We're going to give you some tools and techniques today to help you through this sequence of events. I don't want you to panic. So in the words of the immortal Douglas Adams, don't panic, but bring a towel. Any Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans out there. Don't panic. The sky is not falling yet, but you have to start working, especially if you process CUI. There's a lot to do. Right now, cybersecurity compliance, so the CMMC has not fully been implemented yet. We can be compliant with the current DFARS clause by implementing 3 things. Get a plan for the expected outcome for your cybersecurity program, an SSP. There will be weaknesses in this plan for most of us. We want a plan to address those weaknesses in the form of a plan of action and milestones, a corrective action plan. And then beat this horse to death, you also need this cyber incident and reporting capability. So you can be compliant with 3 plans, assuming that you can demonstrate that you're working on implementing those plans. You can be compliant with the current regime. And there's also lots of good news for you as you develop these plans. There's a lot of wiggle room in 800-171 and in the CMMC to create custom policies for your organization that make sense, that are sensible for how your organization operates. For instance, when it comes, the 800-171 and CMMC are completely technology agnostic. They don't tell you at all what technology, what boxes you have to buy to put in your environment. You can make the choice as long as it meets the spirit of these requirements. The 800-171 does not get into the weeds and dictate how long your passwords should be on your user accounts or what type of multi-factor authentication you use. You get to make the choice. And there's lots of free and open source technology options out there. I'll give you some examples here. Each of these are links. So Netmon Freemium is a free version of a network traffic analysis tool that is published by a company called Logarithm out of Boulder, Colorado. It's a very powerful, effective tool. It checks several boxes in the 800-171 standard. Security Onion is a free and open source, what we call SIM, that's Security Information and Event Management tool. It's essentially you're going to have some sort of security operations and analysis capability to be compliant. And this type of tool is the backbone of that capability. So if you choose to implement that capability in-house, there are free tools that you can do it with. Many of you will choose to outsource that capability to a managed security service provider, which will probably for many of you end up being cheaper. That's also fair game. You can outsource a lot of this technology related stuff to very capable managed security service providers. You have to bear in mind though that you cannot outsource all of this stuff. You will need to develop a cybersecurity culture within your organization, just like those of you in the manufacturing environments need to develop a safety culture within your organization. If you don't have that culture from the top down, from the CEO, president, board of directors on down, then that culture that program is doomed to fail. It's true with safety. If the CEO doesn't wear his or her safety goggles on the shop floor, everybody's going to think it's okay not to. Likewise, if the CEO doesn't pay attention to the cybersecurity awareness and training stuff and allocate resources for the cybersecurity program, that program's doomed to fail. Sorry, a little bit of a tangent there on the culture, but GoFish is a free and open source tool to help exercise your employees on recognizing what is the single biggest threat facing all organizations in all industry sectors of all size, and that is the threat of social engineering, particularly through phishing emails. And that's PHISH. Then to help you develop your system security plan policies, there's lots of free resources to draw from. This link will take you to NIST's site, this US government link. NIST has tons of free policy developments and cybersecurity related documentation in their 800- series. There's lots of goodies in there. There's also lots of, there's some work you have to do to separate the signal from the noise. I always say, like, if you're having trouble sleeping at night, pull up the 800-171 document and read it from start to finish. And you'll get through like 2 pages and you'll be asleep. But in that, there's lots of goodies. SANS Institute. Some of you online may have taken a cybersecurity training course from the SANS Institute, which is, in my mind, one of the preeminent cybersecurity training organizations out there. They have tons of free goodies, free policy resources. That's a link to their stuff. The Australian Cybersecurity Center, ACSC, their equivalent of our NSA, they also have a ton of free policy resources. So there's lots of really good news. And this is where I got to put my cynical hat on a little bit. From all what's apparent, or what has been made apparent from the DoD, is that the current assessment methodology, which we'll get into shortly here after a break and in the next section, this assessment methodology would be complementary and concurrent to another assessment methodology, the CMMC, which will be coming in latter part of this year, next year. So we could be faced with, those of us that process CUI, we could be faced with two compliance regimes. I don't think that's sustainable for the Department of Defense. I think ultimately the CMMC will be the bread and butter when it comes to holding us accountable. But for now, we have this strategic assessment methodology, which, as I mentioned, requires us to generate a score of compliance and report that score. And the DCMA folks and DCSA, so Defense Contract Management Agency and Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, they have teams that are actually conducting what they consider higher confidence audits, and they were coming on site before COVID, but they're doing virtual reviews of your SSP and virtual vetting that you truly have the cybersecurity protections in place. So they are doing that type of stuff. When the CMMC is released, it will be, certification will be required to execute every contract for the Department of Defense. The basics of CMMC. It will be a license to operate. You will have to have a CMMC certification at some level, and we'll talk about the levels here in just a second, to, well, actually, this is just changed, actually. You're gonna have to have a license to execute DoD contracts. It looks like you might not have a certification to execute DoD contracts. You may not have to have the certification to be able to be part of a proposal team. Ultimately, that'll depend on the prime contractors and the contracting office, but it looks like this clause may be going away. But at a minimum, to do any work for the DoD, you're gonna have to have a certification. They being the DoD, said they were gonna start phasing this requirement into 10 or so Pathfinder contracts this year. That would involve about 1,500 contractors, and they hinted that these Pathfinder contracts would be those of us that work on the nuclear arsenal and missile defense programs. This has since, they may be able to do this in the fourth quarter of 2020. They had originally targeted quarter 2, quarter 3. I think they'll be able to start doing some of this in quarter 4. But for those of us at large, the CMMC is not going to be written into our contracts or flowed down to us from a prime until spring of 2021 at the earliest, it appears. And then they're going to be doing a phased approach of these requirements through over a 5-year period. It's not clear what contracts they're going to prioritize. It's not clear whether your large prime contractors like Boeing, so for any Boeing contract, if the entirety of their supply chain is going to have to be simultaneously certified, none of that is clear. This is still very foggy. I'm just trying to lay out for you the basics as we know them right now. To get a CMMC certification, you, as the contractor, are going to have to pay to hire a CMMC third-party assessment organization, C3PAO. And yes, this is an intentional, almost homonym with the droid from Star Wars. There are geeks in cybersecurity all the way up to the top of the food chain. You're going to hire the C3PAO to perform an assessment and issue those certifications. There are no licensed C3PAOs. There will not be any licensed C3PAOs until maybe the end of this year, and certainly and probably into 2021. If anybody is selling you a certification or their service that they say will result in a certification, they are selling you snake oil at this point. So do not be misled. There are not even any licensed assessors yet that these organizations can even hire. Okay? It doesn't mean you shouldn't be working towards compliance. Don't stick your head in the sand. There's stuff you have to do, but you cannot purchase a certification yet. All right, the CMMC model is comprised of two sort of staircases. And you're going to have to prove to get a certification that you have process maturity as well as practice maturity. The practices are synonymous with controls, safeguards, the best practices, that the things you have to do to secure the information. And then process maturity, I'll talk about here on the next slide. There are 5 levels of possible certification. We all will have to be certified at least level 1, which means we have some basic, those 17 basic cybersecurity practices in place, and we're going to have to show that we perform those practices. Most of us those of us that process, store, transmit CUI will be level 3, where we'll have to implement 130 practices spread over 17 capability domains. So they've changed the name family to domains. And by the way, it's just a coincidence that there are 17 capability domains and 17 basic practices in level 1. That's just a coincidence. They're not related. Those numbers are not related. That's a common mistake that we see in our clients. All right, those of us that process CUI are going to have to be level 3. Level 2 is reserved for a sort of transition organization, and also it appears for our IT managed service providers. So if you outsource your IT to a managed service provider, those folks at that MSP have really God-level privilege over all of your information. They are the system administrators. They can access whatever they want. They are themselves going to have to be CMMC certified if they have potential access to your CUI. This is going to come as a big shock to a lot of your MSPs. And this will expand actually the certification for CMMC from 350,000 of us that are contractors to also include all of our MSPs, including our managed security service providers. And we may be looking at something like 500,000 different organizations that have to be CMMC certified. It's a behemoth. Level 4 and level 5 are reserved for your much riskier organizations, the really high value targets like your big prime contractors that are consistently targeted by what we call advanced persistent threat. That's a nation state level adversary like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, organized crime. So there will be very few of us in the contractor base that are level 4 or level 5 certified. The indication is somewhere around 100, maybe 200 organizations. So most of us that need to focus on level 3, all of us need to focus on at least level 1. This is a slide that sort of reiterates what I was just talking about. Level 1 is all of us, 17 basic practices. Level 3 is all CUI processors. There are 130 practices, so CMMC actually adds an additional 20 controls to the 800-171 set of controls. And part of my cynicism with CMMC is that fully half of these 20 controls are absolutely redundant to controls that have already been published and required of us in 800-171. You can look at it from the sunny side in that, okay, well, redundancy just means that we just reiterate in our policy what we're already doing, but it also is more time that we have to spend addressing stuff that we've already addressed. If you're interested in knowing more about these 20 additional practices, we actually have a blog on this topic. There's a link to it. What does it mean to be mature? And I think this is the last slide in this section, and then we'll take a break. Yep. Josh, let me get through this slide, and if there are any questions relevant to this first section, we'll do that real quick, and then we'll take a break after those questions.
Sounds good.
All right, 5 different maturity levels in CMMC: performed, documented, managed, reviewed, optimized. This middle column shows you the CMMC verbatim text on the description of the maturity level, and then this right-hand column is our, in a nutshell or layman's terms, translation of what it means. So at maturity level 1, you have to demonstrate that you perform the best practice. At maturity level 2, so that you do it. At maturity level 2, you have to demonstrate that you do it and that you have the process for doing it documented. At level 3, which most of us that process CUI will be in, we have to demonstrate that we do it, document, and that we have it resources for it, so that we have budget for procuring and operating the technology, that we have the necessary folks on staff or outsourced with the proper skills to execute the program. At level 4, we have to do it, document, demonstrate resources for it, and put some sort of metrics in place to measure the effectiveness of our cybersecurity program, and then fix the broken aspects of it. And then level 5, optimize, do it, document, demonstrate resources for it, measure its effectiveness, and automate it across the enterprise with feedback loops in place. Any of you that have operated in an environment that is, has a CMMI, Capability Maturity Model Index requirement on a federal government contract, this stuff is going to look very familiar to you. And in fact, CMMC draws heavily from the CMMI model. In fact, one of the members of the board of directors of the CMMC accreditation body that's in charge of licensing the assessors is a strong proponent of CMMI. So whatever you think about CMMI, good or bad, know that the CMMC draws heavily upon it. If you're interested in the goings-on and the current state of affairs, I'm typing into the chat cmmcab.org. This is the website for the CMMC accreditation body. This is a private 501c organization that the DoD has tasked with executing the assessments. So they're going to be licensing the C3PAOs, licensing the assessors, and you're going to be paying them, or you're going to be paying the assessors that they license to execute your assessment and provide the certification. So they have national listening sessions at cmmcab.org, and you can see the latest goings on in the process for spinning up these C3PAOs. All right, so that is a fire hose, I know. You can download these slides and click on any of those links and do some more research on your own. Happy to take a question or two before we break here, Josh, if there are any.
Sounds good. So just 2 questions. The first one, can G Suite tools be used for that first level of certification?
G Suite can be used for CMMC level 1 to process federal contract information, yes. We do not recommend processing it or using G Suite for controlled unclassified information, level 3. And I won't go too far in the weeds. Oh man, there we go. On that topic, but I will introduce you to our Totem knowledge base. So this is a subreddit. It's like a forum. And we get asked the question, can I use Google G Suite for CUI? So I'm going to pop this link into the chat instead of, this is a whole rabbit hole we can go down, and it'll take up too much time in this workshop. But if you're interested in knowing more about why we do not recommend G Suite for CUI, for that CMMC level 3, bottom line, we don't recommend it. You can read more here. Great question, by the way. And I like talking about this topic. It just, like I said, it's a rabbit hole.
Sure. And then one other question that I had, one of the listeners asks for some practical advice on how to monitor logs from workstations and firewalls as required by the NIST SP 800-171. They're looking for like reasonably priced software, any sort of recommendation that you might have as far as the monitoring goes.
Yeah, so let's talk about this for 2 minutes. My recommendation is to outsource it. This is the single most challenging capability for a small business organization to implement in-house. There are free tools out there like that Security Onion tool that I mentioned before. The long pole in the tent, though, is that you cannot put these tools in place if you don't have the human eyes on them to do the monitoring. And those human eyes are expensive, okay? At a minimum, a trained and skilled security operator is going to cost an organization about 75 grand a year. and it's probably over 6 figures for even moderate level skill set and talent. So our recommendation is to outsource this capability. You're still going to be paying some money, but if you choose a legitimate outsourced partner, and I can make some recommendations. Actually, Haight Bay & Associates, we use GuardSight out of Cedar City in Utah. So it's a Utah-based company. They are quite talented and good friends and partners. But there are other MSSPs out there, but we highly recommend outsourcing. And I would not have said that 2 years ago. We thought at Haight Bay that we could perform that capability ourselves, but we quickly realized that it's a full-time job to maintain the tools and have the eyes on the tools that you need.
Perfect. Thank you.
Anything else?
That's it for now. I think we can take our break.
Yeah, so what do we want to do, Joshua? We want to do 15 minutes?
Sure. Let's, or maybe we should do 10 minutes. Be back here.
At 20 after?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
Okay. So yeah, so we'll be back at 20 after and pick back up with scoping your plan. Josh, I'm back and ready to go whenever you are.
Perfect. Let's go ahead and continue.
All right. One sip of tea. All right, welcome back. Josh, any questions that I need to address from the first section there?
Nope, we're caught up.
Okay, perfect. All right, so second section, we're going to be talking about scoping your system security plan, which dictates the expectations and state of your cybersecurity program that provides adequate security for the Department of Defense information that you store, process, transmit. The first question, though, that many of you are asking, and that we continue to ask, we, Haight Bay & Associates and Totem Tech, how do I know what is CUI in our environment? How do I know if our organization processes CUI? You say, Adam, we all process FCI, and we're all going to have to be CMMC level 1 certified. How do I know if I need to prepare for CMMC level 3? It's a great question. The answer to which is, it is not your job to guess. It is the Department of Defense's job to explicitly identify CUI and flow that identification down through its supply chain. How do I know it's their job? I told you DODI 5200.48 is going to be the single most valuable piece of information you take away from this workshop. There's a link to it. I suggest you download this document and read it in its entirety. It's not one of those in this documents. It'll put you to sleep after half an hour, not after 5 minutes. But do yourself a favor and read it. And then pay attention to a couple of sections in particular. Section 3.7e, CUI will be identified in security classification guides to ensure such information receives adequate protection. This SCG is a very specific document, specifically formatted. The DoD knows what this is, knows how to handle these security classification guides. It has done a poor job of identifying CUI on contracts and identifying SCGs and pushing them down. As a prime contractor, Haight Bay & Associates has yet to receive and I say we've been working on a program for 5 years, yet to receive a security classification guide, yet to receive a single piece of documentation or indication that any of the information in our environment is CUI. I know we process some, but it's not my job to guess. So you can push back on your prime contractors and directly to the Department of Defense if you're a prime contractor yourself, saying, hey, We can no longer operate in an environment where we have to guess what the CUI is, because we're going to have to pretty soon here get certified as by a CMMC assessment. Section 5.1e, the program office or requiring activity. This is a DoD entity. This is not your prime contractor's program manager. This is a DoD requiring activity. Must identify DoD CUI at the time of contract award. And 5.3b, protective measures and dissemination controls will be articulated in the contract or other legal agreement as appropriate. It's fine that they call out the DFARS 204, 252, 7012 clause in the contract, but all contractual information is not CUI. All contractual information is FCI, and some subset of that information is CUI. So if you press back on your prime contractor and they say, well, just treat everything like it's CUI, that's not fair, it's not appropriate, and it's not legal. I'm not a lawyer, okay? So don't take this as legal advice. I'm just telling you, you can read this DODI and you can see these sections, and it tells the DOD what to do. And if they're not doing it on your contract, you can push back. Now, there is an DoD CUI registry for those of you that are interested in digging a little bit more deeply into what could possibly be considered CUI in your environment. You can, I think you have to have a CAT card or a certificate to actually access this link right here. But if you suspect that you have CUI in your environment, there are some potential indicators you can look out for. Markings on documents. So many of you, maybe most of you, maybe all of you have seen some sort of document in the past or been to a DoD website that has unclassified, probably maybe in green text at the top of the document or top of the web page, or unclassified / FOUO. This is for official use only. These markings have actually been superseded by the controlled unclassified marking. So if you see CUI or controlled on any document or website, then you know that information is CUI. So that's Leo's saying, yep. If you see CUI, it's CUI. But if you see unclassified or FOUO, that might be an indicator. Distribution statements. So some of you are going to have in your contract the requirement to place a distribution statement. Here, we have an example of distribution statement C here. You might have to put this on certain documents that you develop or process for the DoD. That's a pretty good indication that it's going to be CUI, but not the end-all be-all indication, because as 5200.48 shows us, it's the DoD's job to tell us. This link here is a link to the various, there are 6 different types of distribution statements, A through F, and you can find those at this link. We get asked the question all the time, ITAR and EAR, export controlled information. It's probably CUI, like 99.9% CUI. In fact, ITAR is its own class of CUI. But ITAR is not under the DoD's index of CUI. This is getting nuanced and subtle, but ultimately it depends on the Department of Defense on your contract to designate ITAR as CUI for that particular contract. And there, if you're already processing export controlled information, there are some cybersecurity controls that you already have in place to protect this information. But they're probably, if you haven't implemented 800.171, they're probably not enough. 800.171 and the CMMC is another level of protection above and beyond the cybersecurity protections that are dictated for ITAR.
Adam, would the information about whether it was CUI, would that also potentially show up in the DD 254?
Oh, very well could. Yep. So DD 254 is a document that's attached to a contract that indicates what elements of that contract are classified. So secret, top secret, or confidential, and basic instructions for what the organization's expected to do to handle that type of information. I have not yet seen a DD 254 that talked about CUI, but it could potentially be in that document. It is important, though, to distinguish There is classified information that's top secret, secret, or confidential. CUI is not a classification, it's a categorization. It's controlled, unclassified information. It's kind of like a classification, but it's not classified material. CUI is separate from classified material. It's a whole different set of protections and controls that we have to put in place. Great question. First time I've heard that question. Great question. All right. You suspect that you have CUI environment, CUI process stored or transmitted in your environment, to from your environment. What do you need to do to start preparing for the CMMC? The first thing you need to do before you start developing your SSP, before you do a system self-assessment against the scoring methodology, is to get a handle and an understanding of your environment. We call this exercise performing a CUI and IT system inventory. So you're going to ask, get all the stakeholders involved in your organization involved in brainstorming, asking yourselves these questions. Like some of them are going to be easily answered, like who owns the system? Well, it's Acme organization or it's Hay Bain Associates. But start writing down in a document where it's located. Well, we have a brick and mortar facility in West Haven, Utah, but we also use cloud services XYZ. Why? Why do we have a brick and mortar facility? Do we process DoD information there? Why do we use cloud services? Do we process DoD information there? Is it currently operational, or are we spinning up a new entity to do this work? Or are we modifying an existing organization and IT system to do this work? Describe use cases of the system. How does information flow into the IT system? How is it stored? How is it processed? And who accesses it inside of the system? And to whom do we disseminate it to and how? Describe that information lifecycle. Describe it in narrative and or graphical, so words and pictures, as much as you can. The more that you can do this, the more that you can describe your system, the better you will be able to convince an assessor that you understand the system. And the better that you can convince them that you understand it, the more leeway they're going to give you if you don't quite meet the letter of a law, a letter of a regulation. I've witnessed that on DoD assessments. That if you, the more that you know the weaknesses, the more that you know the footprint of your system and the weaknesses in that system, the better off your relationship with the assessor will be. As long as you're transparent with those. A general description of the technologies that are involved: hardware, software, firmware, networking devices, cloud services. To include, so you want an overall general description, but you also want an inventory of all of the hardware and all of the software in your system that's used to store, process, transmit CUI. So you can see here why it behooves you to shrink the footprint of your system that processes, stores, transmits CUI to as small as possible, because this is all work that you have to do, or it'll reduce the amount of work that you have to do to prep for an assessment and build a cybersecurity program. Then you want to categorize or characterize all the interconnections that your IT system, recalling that system means hardware, software, networking stuff, the people that use the stuff and the procedures that they use it with. You want to characterize connections that your system makes to external systems and what type of information is shared over those connections. In general, you have two high-level approaches for building your cybersecurity program and what we call scoping the SSP. And both of these approaches have pros and cons. The first approach is to isolate CUI to a separate information system. So you can isolate it physically, like you could have a completely separate server rack that doesn't touch your other corporate information server rack. or you can isolate it logically through network segmentation, or maybe even procure a cloud service just to do DoD work. But you can isolate the DoD related information from the rest of your corporate information and maintain a separate system just to process it. Or you can do like Hay Associates does, and because we were forced into this, we built a legacy IT system before these regulations came in place. Many of you in the manufacturing environment are going to be like this. You started your business in your garage with a single lathe. And now you have a multi-million-dollar corporation with $100,000 CNC machines. But you built that IT system organically over this 35, 40 years of building your business. And all of your information is already commingled, and now you're slapped with, not slapped, but now you're faced with requirements to secure that information. Your information is necessarily commingled with other organizational data. And so you have to apply the adequate security to the entire IT system. Now, pros of approach number one are you can really minimize resource expenditure on this very particular and nuanced cybersecurity program. But the cons are, well, there might be a trade-off in that we actually have to pay, we have to pay additional money to maintain this separate IT system, or maintain or pay our MSP more money to segment our network and provide different sets of protections. Cons of approach number two, are that you're going to be expending probably more resources to provide this adequate security. But the pro is all of this other organizational data is also important to you. You have human resources data with personally identifiable information. You have financial information, federal tax information. You have other intellectual property. You have other customer, non-DoD client data hanging around in your network. You can apply adequate security to all of that stuff that's worthy of protection. And NIST 800-171 is a fantastic set of pretty in-depth best practices for securing any type of unclassified information. PII, federal tax information, protected health information, so human resource or healthcare information. So there's pros and cons to both approaches. But back to the footprinting and fingerprinting of your system. How do you start with this? Where do you start? I said gather all the stakeholders together, but what are we supposed to do when we gather them all together? Well, we've given you some resources. Let me exit out of this and jump into cover sheet. So recall that there's a link in the chat to our share file, and you can go download all the goodies from this workshop. This is one of those goodies. This is what we call our SSP cover sheet, and we use this ourselves. In this cover sheet, there's red text, which is meant to be instructional for you and sort of prompts for you to go fill out these various suggested sections. And I say suggested, none of this is technically required by 800-171. Having a system security plan cover sheet is not one of the 110 requirements, but it's a really good idea, especially if you're interested in convincing an assessor that you have a handle on your system. So you can go through and describe your system in general. And by the way, it doesn't have to, you don't have to use a cover sheet. It does not have to be in Word format. I'm actually gonna, after I get through this Word document, I'm gonna show you a spreadsheet that we capture a lot of this information on. We call it our CUI and system inventory. We use the SSP cover sheet and the CUI and system inventory spreadsheet in conjunction to fully describe our system. So system description, general description of what you think is CUI in your environment and the life cycle of that CUI in your environment. And here's a really nice approach I like for that. Get yourself a table, describe who you receive it from, what it is, how it's received, how you store it, if you store it externally, how do you process it and who has access to it internally, how you transmit it, and to whom. So here's an example for us, for Haight Bay & Associates. We receive from the U.S. Air Force Program Management Office what the Air Force calls a technical order, which is essentially a user manual for an IT system. We receive it through the DoD maintained file sharing system. It's called SAFE. I'll type the URL to that. It's https safe.apps.mil. If you have a CAT card, you can use this for free to receive and transmit information. Also, we have government furnished laptops, and they can send us an encrypted email if they like. We store it on an on-premise file server. We also fully encrypt it and then store offsite in a cloud backup. Why do we get it? Well, it's because my engineering and our engineering team maintains and updates these things for the Air Force as part of our contract. And then we send it right back to the Air Force when we're done through those same transmission mechanisms. And then for each piece or element that you think is CUI in your environment, you would capture the same life cycle. It's a really good thought exercise to get your stakeholders thinking about, well, what is truly CUI in our environment? In a manufacturing environment, is a part number truly CUI? Or does it only become CUI when it's in a bill of lading that tells us that when we're telling the Army that we're shipping 20 missile engine components to Bagram Air Force Base? Is that when it becomes CUI? I don't know. I can't tell you that. It's up to the DoD to confirm it, but you can use your best judgment. And if you think so, then I would categorize that as a piece of CUI and capture its life cycle here. Okay, a general system overview. A list of, maybe not a list, but a description of how many total system users you have, how many of those users have access or authorized access to your CUI, and how many of them are privileged. So system administrators. And then a description of both the physical and logical environment in your IT system. And I'll scroll down here. Wait, it's at the bottom. Nope. What am I looking for? Diagrams. Oh yeah, okay. Picture's worth 1,000 words. So describe it in general, in words, but then we highly recommend a network topology diagram. So a diagram that shows all of the IT hardware assets and how they're connected in your environment, including cloud services. Data flow diagrams, how a graphical depiction of how CUI especially flows into your environment and out of your environment. Functional architecture diagrams are more abstract types of diagrams that show, hey, we have this particular function, we have engineering function capability within our organization. Here's the types of hardware and software that they use, and here's where they share information over these various interfaces. You definitely want a full inventory of your hardware and software, and also a software baseline. And I'm going to pop into the spreadsheet here in a few minutes, and I'll show you examples of these, as well as an interconnections inventory. You are required by 800-171 to have hardware and software inventory, software baseline, interconnections inventory. It's a good idea to have diagrams. Contact information, especially for those roles in your environment that have security duties, some sort of physical or cybersecurity duty. You definitely want their contact information listed. We have a tool for you to list that information. That's our spreadsheet, which I'm going to pop into in a second. And then a quick introduction to the SSP itself. So for the SSP itself, NIST has a SSP template that you can download from the 800-171 webpage. I'll pop that link in the chat. So it's this SSP template right here. I have it downloaded and open. It's just a Word document with a place for system identification. So essentially they're saying, you know, have something like an SSP cover sheet. And then they just go, yeah, so more SSP cover sheet type of stuff. And then they go line by line with the controls. Is it implemented? Do you plan on implementing it? Is it not applicable? And then describe the implementation. So you can use that. We actually built a purpose-built tool for us and our clients. We call it the Totem tool. It's an online tool. We list all of the safeguard requirements, all of the controls in the tool, and then as well as all of the individual actions that we have to take. I told you there were 320 actions. So like a differentiator between this tool and NIST's SSP template is that they don't dive into the actions. And we say, well, if they're going to assess us on performing these actions, we better address these actions. But there is no required, by the way, we can export all this information that we could contain in our tool out in a spreadsheet. So if I were asked or tasked to hand off my SSP, it would be in an Excel spreadsheet format. It's essentially all this information you see here just in spreadsheet. But there's no set format for an SSP. In fact, NIST is saying you can use a Word document too. So there's no set format. So we would introduce whatever format we have our SSP in from our cover sheet. Okay, the last thing we have in this cover sheet is a table that some of you may find useful. What we say at Haight Bay and some of our manufacturing clients can also say is that the scope of their system security plan, of their cybersecurity program for protecting CUI, only extends to what we call traditional IT. Because traditional IT, things like laptops, servers, cloud services, data centers, enterprise applications like CAD software or PDM file management software. It's only through that traditional IT components that we would actually store, process, and transmit CUI. Documents that could be marked CUI or media with CUI. All the non-traditional IT, things like our test bench equipment, ICS, industrial control systems in a manufacturing environment, CNC machines perhaps, other industrial Internet of Things, so operational technology, research and development systems, and then government furnished property are not part of our traditional IT that we process CUI on, and so we descope it from our SSP. I can't speak for everyone's environment, but you may be able to make this argument and significantly reduce the footprint of your cybersecurity program. So if you're in a manufacturing environment and you sneakernet so you physically copy on a USB drive or something, CNC code, and take it to your CNC machines, that CNC code may not be considered CUI. It's going to depend on your program. But if it's not considered CUI, then your machines, even if they're networked, your machines that actually do the machining may not be considered part of your covered contractor information system, and it significantly simplifies your task of applying adequate security. I'm not saying this is true across the board. I'm saying you're going to have to do some investigation and analysis, but this definition of traditional versus non-traditional IT has, for a fact, been used to justify descoping non-traditional IT from a system security plan. I know it has. We have done it with clients of ours, and I know of other instances where it has been done. I'm not trying to skirt rules. I'm trying to keep this process manageable for you and as resource manageable as possible. Okay, this is the system security plan, or system security plan cover sheet. Another tool that we have for you to download is the CUI and system inventory worksheet with a bunch of tabs. Okay? I'm going to take you briefly through each one of these tabs. Each one of these tabs is meant to address a particular set of requirements in 800.171, so help you check that box in 800.171. There's nothing superfluous or extraneous about any part of this worksheet. It's all required. We have the system inventory blank template, and then let me make sure that I also popped in, oh, it's gonna make me log back in. Well, here's a good opportunity to show you my password manager, which is not required of 800.171, but a good idea. We use LastPass, stores my credentials. And multi-factor authentication fail. I had the browser remember my username and password. All right, let me make sure I got this workshop goodies. Yes, I have the example org Rev 03 August 2020 available for you to download. So this is an example with some stuff filled in. Everything in yellow you would need to update here, but on the CUI inventory, your task is to identify all CUI elements in your organization, describe them generally. What type of media are they on, digital or physical? If you're in the DoD realm, the index is always going to be defense. And unless you work on nuclear or critical infrastructure programs, it's probably going to be CTI category. List if you have any dissemination controls called out by your contract. So if you have any distribution statements called out, list them here. What government agency, quote unquote, owns the CUI? Is it the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, DLA, Army Corps of Engineers? What department in that agency? Describe how you receive each element, how you store it internally, who can access it internally and how. Do you have any contractually defined marking or identification requirements that you have to put? So like, are you required to mark certain hard drives or DVDs or Word documents with CUI label? It's going to be required in contract if you are. And then how do you disseminate it outside of your organizational control? General descriptions. And then disposal. All of the CUI is going to be disposed of in accordance with a NIST sanitization guide, and that's the NIST 800-88. I'd encourage you to become familiar with those sanitization requirements. So this is a tab, this is a worksheet that's going a long way to describe to the assessors that we have a handle on CUI in our environment, all the way through the life cycle of it in our environment. I'm going to jump over to interconnections inventory. You're required to maintain an inventory of all of the interconnections, whether they be manual or automatic, that connect your system to some sort of external system by which CUI may be shared across them. So a lot of very common interconnections that many of us will have is some sort of automated offsite backup connection. Active Directory in a Windows environment, directory control. If you're able to use the DoD Safe app, that's an interconnection. It's a manually connected connection, but it's an interconnection. If the DoD or prime contractor allows you to access a VPN, virtual private network, that's an interconnection. Your security operations team is going to have some sort of, probably they're going to have some sort of agents, some sort of software in your environment that they use to monitor your environment. That's an interconnection. That software has an interconnection to a console. IT management, your IT MSP probably has some sort of what we call remote maintenance and management tool, RMM. Examples of this are SolarWinds, Spiceworks, LionGuard, RapidFire. There's dozens of these. LandSweeper. But it's a connection. If you do shipping and you use FedEx printing services online, that's a connection. It's a potential source of CUI transmission, so on and so forth. Describe the purpose. Describe what CUI is shared across those connections. You're required to do all this, by the way, in 800.171. And I keep telling you that, but let me prove it to you. If I search in, I need all families, and if I search interconnections, designated sources and destinations for CUI within the system and between interconnected systems are identified. It's an action that you have to take. You have to identify them. No better place than on something like this. All right, general description of if it's automatic, web-based, if it's a manual connection. What general security measures are in place? Do you have an SLA that defines security measures? Is there a VPN? Is multi-factor authentication used? And then, especially if you're going to transmit CUI, that CUI has to be encrypted and has to be encrypted with a certain strength of encryption. So you'll describe the encryption mechanism and the authentication mechanism here. Okay. Hardware inventory. Your IT team or your IT MSP may already have a tool that they use to maintain an inventory of all the hardware and software on your network. Awesome. Do not reinvent the wheel. Reference the assessor to the output and reports from that tool. If you don't have a tool like that, an RMM tool, then you can use a spreadsheet and capture relevant information, relevant attributes about all of the hardware in your covered system. Hardware details, software and operating system details. Configuration of how the piece of hardware connects to the network. Endpoint security. So you're required to have at minimum antivirus installed in all pertinent locations. Many of you will opt for some higher level protection than simple antivirus. And there are dozens of types of endpoint security tools out there like CrowdStrike, Sophos. You just want to describe what you have in place. You are also required to harden all of your covered components. So by hardening, we mean configuring the system to be a little bit more secure than it comes out of the box. So for instance, many of you are going to have third-party Wi-Fi routers on your home networks. Some of you are going to be using the cable, the modem provided by the cable company or the internet service provider like your Comcast, Cox, InfoWest, whatever, modems to provide a Wi-Fi signal. That's not a great practice. It's not a best practice. A better practice is to procure your own controlled Wi-Fi router. Out of the box, and you can buy nice, really nice Wi-Fi routers on Amazon for like 40 bucks. Out of the box though, those routers come with a default username and password. It's default, it facilitates you setting up the device. The problem is the adversaries also know what those default passwords are, and if you don't harden the device and change that default password and turn off access to that device from the internet, then the adversary can just come right in from the internet using the default password and now can take control of your Wi-Fi router. And I'm not a fear pusher. I'm just telling you that that's a reality. And how many folks are on here? 54. One of you at least has a home Wi-Fi router that's configured with the default parameters. I would put money on it. So this is what we're talking about with device hardening. And there's lots of things you can do to harden any given device. You just have to harden it. It's required by 800-171, and you should very well capture the information about how you've hardened it. Software baseline. Establish and list the software that forms the foundation for any given component in your environment, and that this baseline represents if a component in your environment is compromised, to what baseline would you return that component? So if there's malware installed on your CEO's laptop, How do you know what normal looks like for that laptop? What's the baseline, right? So capture a baseline. Some of your IT MSPs are going to have tools that already do this for you. Awesome. Just reference that tool from your SSP. If you don't have a tool like that, you can do it as simply as a spreadsheet. So all workstations have Windows 10 with Office 365 and Firefox. Our mobile workstations also have a VPN client. Accounting has QuickBooks. Engineering has some, well, we're cybersecurity engineers, so we have some cybersecurity software, but you may have CAD software listed here. And the shipping workstation has shipping related software. And then do the same thing for the servers that you control in your environment. Contact list. Really good idea to have a contact list for all of the roles within your organization that have some sort of security responsibility. We have a sort of general list of roles here. You would capture all their contact information and then over here indicate whether or not they have access to CUI and then whether or not they have access to privileged accounts, system administrator level accounts. You're required to identify all users of CUI and all users that have privileged access. Then you can take these roles, copy them, go to your duties and responsibilities tab, transpose, paste them in the roles as columns across the top, and then identify for each of these roles what duties they perform in the environment. What you have here listed in column C is a list of all of the possible personnel that the assessors could interview in your environment. These lists of duties come straight out of NIST 800-171. So as part of the assessment objective, the assessor will be instructed to go interview the person responsible for media sanitization, or go interview the person responsible for approving work from home. And you're required to indicate which roles perform which duties and indicate that there's some sort of separation of duties in your environment. Okay, so this might be a little bit hard to see over the Zoom, but we've indicated through color coding that system developers and system network administrators are a different color duty than personnel responsible for overall approval of our plans and governance. And in our system security plan, we've said, okay, the folks at the executive level folks that approve the policies, approve the plan, shall not be the same folks that implement the plan. We want to separate governance from administration so that your inmates don't run the asylum. If you task your network administrator with doing all of this stuff, you're going to be paying a lot because they're going to buy some fancy equipment that you may not need, and they're really good at IT stuff, but they might not be really good at strategic plan development. So you're required to figure out what duties in your environment you want to separate. You can indicate the separation of duties through a worksheet like this, and you can check that box, and all we got to do is show that our system administrator performs the duties of development and network administration, but does not perform the governance and plan and policy making duties in our organization. Cool. So this CUI and system inventory worksheet is a tool that you guys can use if you don't already have tools that do this stuff to capture all of this information that you're required to capture to have a CMMC level 3 worthy system security plan. All right. This is scoping your plan. The end result of understanding what your hardware is, understanding what your software is, understanding what CUI you process, understanding the interconnections by which you might share CUI. The end result is that you now have a footprint of your IT system, hardware, software, network, people, processes, and procedures. And now you can start writing your SSP, your system security plan. Now you can start setting up your cybersecurity program to protect all of this stuff that you just identified. But you can't protect what you don't know you have. So the identification is that necessary first step. Josh, let me pause there for questions.
Thank you. This is fantastic information. So just a couple questions. So
Yep.
going back to trying to figure out what is considered CUI and what isn't, someone asks, what if no indicators can be found within a contract that are classified or unclassified? Would this be considered FCI?
Yeah, so at a minimum, you're processing FCI. So no indicators to me means you do not have the DFAR 7012 clause written into a contract or flowed down to you. You do not have a prime contractor instructing you to be compliant with NIST 800-171. You have nothing marked CUI or FOUO in your environment. You do not have a security classification guide associated with that environment. And you don't process any information that might fall into one of these categories. Let me find the slide here. You don't process engineering drawings. You don't process technical manuals, software source code. So that's the process. That's the mental process I'm going through to eliminate CUI from my environment. And if you can do all that, then what you're left with is you simply process federal contract information, and you therefore would be beholden to level 1 CMMC.
Excellent.
Or-
Okay.
Yep.
And then second question, they would like you to discuss a prime contractor extending their certification level 3 enclave to a subcontractor.
Enclave, yeah, okay. Yeah, so in this case, you're a subcontractor to a prime contractor. Many prime contractors, in order to get through this whole, in order to nurture their whole supply chain through this CMMC process, will set up some sort of secure operating environment for their supply chain. And that secure operating environment, they're going to call an enclave, or they could call an enclave. And they'll allow their subcontractor and vendor base access into that enclave, and all of the CUI storage processes, transmission, and protection will take place in that enclave. And the subcontractors will sort of inherit the protection of the CMMC level 3 certification from that prime contractor. Many primes are pursuing that route. Others are not. That's the description in general, Josh. I'm not sure if there was a particular question in there.
I think that covered it. Let's see. The duties that are in these inventory sheets that you shared with us are for level 3. They wanted to know what's applicable for level 1. Does the spreadsheet make any differentiation?
No, this worksheet is mostly meant for those of us that are going to be level 3 CUI processors. Although it's not a bad. These are best practices to do all this stuff. Identify the roles within your organization that have some sort of security responsibilities, and then actually identify which particular duties they have. Now, you may not. There's almost 100 different duties that NIST identifies here. Most of us are probably not going to have every single one of these 96 duties executed in our environment. So you can pick and choose. There's nothing requiring you to have all of these duties covered. It's just we're trying to present you with all of the possible people and duties that an assessor could interview.
Excellent. And then let's see. Does the CMMC also have data, relational/non-relational, archival, retention, and purging related mandates and guidance?
Yes, and that is a big question. So let's talk about archiving first. Then it was retention and purging.
Yes.
Archiving. You are required to back up CUI related data and test your backups. Okay, so we can search for controls that are related to backups in here. Regularly perform and test data backups, protect the confidentiality of backups, so it has to be encrypted at storage locations, and then regularly perform complete, comprehensive, resilient data backups. You are required to back up. Retain. The retention period for CUI will be dictated by the contract. It will be different it could be different for every contract. There is no general retention requirement for CUI in general. It's all going to be contract based. Purging. This is what we call sanitization. You are required to sanitize CUI from any equipment before it's removed off site. So those of us that have contracts with printer service companies, if you print CUI on a modern day printer, a copy of that CUI is definitely stored in memory on that printer and may be stored on a hard drive on that printer. So those of us in Salt Lake City area use Les Olson for printer services. You have to have a contract with Les Olson that they understand that they have to sanitize that printer hard drive before they take it off site for maintenance. Sanitization is a whole another can of worms and a rabbit hole we can go down, but I'll type in the chat NIST 800-88. That is the NIST guidance on how you are required to sanitize media with controlled unclassified information. And then even for federal contract information, you're required to sanitize or destroy the media before you dispose of it or release it for reuse. And again, all of these instructions for how to sanitize and destroy are captured in NIST 800-88. Oh, you know what? I'm putting this stuff only to one person. My apologies, guys. I need to be typing this to everyone. NIST 800-88. Sorry, there's probably, yeah, that looks like the last one that I missed in the chat. So that was a heavy question, Josh. I'm skimming it all, but there are requirements for each.
Sounds good. And then one last question before we break, and this might be something that you have to, I could forward the contact information for this particular individual to discuss offline. This person looked at the Guard site website and saw that their basic services are about $2,500 per month. And so that's about $30,000 a year. So they say for a small user, what would you guess to be the yearly cost to be NIST SP 800-171 compliant?
Oh my gosh.
Items you would not recommend doing in-house, just a rough estimate.
Yeah, so let's talk about the MSSPs first, and then I'll talk rough orders of magnitude of cost. This is a fantastic question. You have to be wary of what you're purchasing from an MSSP. So I said I recommended outsourcing that capability. Basically the security operations and day-to-day monitoring capability. There are lots of viable MSSPs out there. We particularly like GuardSite, and we use GuardSite, and then we use some other ones as well, and we're partnered with some other ones as well. I'm talking about GuardSite because they're Utah-based, and I want to promote Utah companies, and they're also fantastic. What you get for that price is much more than you may get from another MSSP. You are John, who's on me. I don't know. I hope I'm using the right words, John. You're essentially retaining their services in the event for day-to-day operations and also in the event that you have an incident. And they will run that incident to ground to you. Incident response can be very costly and often is very costly. So that fee that you mentioned, I'm not going to get into specific numbers, gets you a lot. It gets you their services and them to help you dig yourself out of a hole. Other services, other MSSPs have very fine security operations, but you may be paying ad hoc or like a la carte in the event that you actually run into an incident. And you have to operate under the assumption that you will have a cybersecurity incident. It's almost 100% certain that any business of any size will have some sort of cyber incident. So you have to pay attention to what you're paying for. So yes, that does add up. But consider the alternative of quote unquote rolling your own security operations capability. You're going to have to staff that capability, and a talented cybersecurity person in this industry, which we are highly sought after, you're looking at paying somebody at least 6 figures to do that. So compare 30,000 to 100,000 plus. Now I can tell you on our journey, Pate Bay & Associates journey, which is not complete and never will be complete, we are in the multiple tens of thousands of dollars a year for outsourcing services, security services. And in total, in our 5-year journey, we are probably close to, if not over, 100,000. Reconfiguring networks, performing training, outsourcing capabilities, and that steady continuous monitoring outsource costs money every year. CMMC level 3 compliance, despite the DoD saying that they're going to make it affordable and somehow allowed cost for a contract, I don't know, but it's easily going to be tens of thousands of dollars per year, even for the small business, because even a one-person shop still has to do all of this stuff. It doesn't scale down very nicely. So we're gonna have to figure out how to incorporate these costs as part of our overhead and doing business with the DoD. But if you look at it from a safety analogy, you have to make your workplace safe for your workers. Not only because you care about your workers, but you're also worried about workman's comp and liability. That's just a cost of doing business, period. Cybersecurity is going to be a cost of doing business. Over. Good. Anything else, Josh?
I think that covers it. So I think now we can break and
Yeah.
back here 11:25.
Yeah, let me take a look at what the next session is. Initial assessment. Yeah, that works. 10 minutes,
Yep.
25 after.
Perfect. All right, we'll reconvene at 11:25.
Excellent, thanks. Okay, I'm back, Josh.
Great, I think we can continue.
All right, any other questions?
Nope, we are all caught up.
Perfect. All right. Okay. CMMC is coming, but for those of us that have the DFAR 7012 clause written into a contract or flowed down to us through a contract, we are under a current compliance and assessment regime for our cybersecurity program to protect CUI. So this is just for those of us that are in the CUI environment. This is not necessarily pertinent to the FCI in that you don't have these assessment scoring and reporting requirements, but this self-assessment process will be useful for those of you in the FCI, only the FCI environment as well. So let's talk about the methodology and the requirements, and then I'll get into a tool that we provide to you to perform the self-assessment. So this last year, 2019, the Department of Defense tasked the DCMA, Defense Contractor Management Agency, to spin up a capability to assess contractors. They did so and actually developed what they call the Cybersecurity Assessment Center for the Defense Industrial Base, so the DIB-CAC, D-I-B-C-A-C. And they undertook a pilot assessment program to develop an assessment methodology. And they executed that pilot program against 15 of the largest prime contractors. And they did that in like Q2, Q3, Q4 of 2019. And in November of 2019, published the first cut of their assessment methodology, which outlines a weighted scoring system for each of the 110 controls, each of the 110 safeguards listed in 800-171. So there's a weighted value, and each of the controls is worth at least 1 point, and it can be worth 3 or 5 points, depending on the priority of implementation of the control. And so for each non-compliant control under this assessment methodology, subtract the score from 110. This can result in a negative score. And in fact, if you have no or minimal cybersecurity program to speak of, you're probably going to end up with a negative score. There's no indication that any of the scores reflect negatively on your organization yet, and you are required to perform a self-assessment and actually report that score and estimated date of full corrective action implementation to the DoD through their supplier performance risk system. Gaining access to that system requires that you purchase a certificate, the same certificate that you'll need to access the incident reporting portal. And you also have to configure a machine to use Internet Explorer, install Java, allow some exceptions for some websites. Any of you that have been through the rigmarole of trying to access a .mil, a DoD website, will understand the trials and travails of configuring a machine to actually get access. Anyway, all of our trials and travails are outlined in a knowledge base post. The link is here on the slide. Let me start at my laser pointer. This link here will take you to our knowledge base post on all of the information about how to get access to this site to report your score. We've always been, since November 2019, those of us with DFAR 7012 have been required to do this. It just has not been widely published, both the assessment methodology and the requirement. This seems about to change. There is currently, actually, I think just this week, the Department of Defense has requested from the Office of Management and Budget an interim emergency update to DFAR 7012, the clause, to require us to do this. So it will be more widely published. It will be part of the DFAR's language that you have to go do this. It's not currently a part of the DFAR's language. I think, this is just my personal opinion, I think they're putting additional emphasis on this assessment methodology because the CMMC timeline has been slipping, and they need a stopgap accountability method to hold us accountable for our cybersecurity programs. And this assessment methodology is that stopgap. Supposedly, the Department of Defense relies on this SPRS and as part of their decision-making process, as part of contract awards. It's not clear how the score, the cybersecurity assessment score, shapes into that contract award. It's not really clear. It's just what is clear is that the Department of Defense is trying to strategically assess the risk to their organization, and this score can help them do that. The self-assessment constitutes a low level of confidence score. The DCMA is also actively conducting what they call higher confidence, moderate or high level confidence audits of the contractor base. The last I heard, they were through 70 or so contractors out of hundreds of thousands of contractors. So it doesn't work very quickly. The moderate level or medium level confidence is just a simple offsite review of your SSP, which implies that you have an SSP to hand them. And then an on-site assessment, which they actually took all virtual when COVID hit. They could actually perform sort of a virtual assessment using the entirety of the 320 assessment objectives in 800-171. So this is the overview of the methodology. We've equipped you with a tool. Let me get out of here. To help perform your self-assessment. Let me bring this over. It's another spreadsheet, and there are some instructions on the first tab of the worksheet. I'll just dive in and sort of take you through the instructions by virtue of actually using the tool. All right, so what you see here is a list of all of the 110 controls in NIST 800-171. There's a control family name, the control family ID, so there are 14 families, there's 1 through 14, and there are various numbers of controls in each family. So for instance, if I just filter on the access control family, there are 22 controls in the access control family. Access control, by the way, both logical and physical access control, constitutes the largest family in 800-171. It's over 20% of the controls are related to controlling who has access and how they have access to the CUI. Okay. The scoring system itself and the workflow through this scoring tool. What you have is in column D is the verbatim description of the control from NIST 800-171. And then we've translated or modified that description into what we term a layman's term, yes or no answerable question. Always starting with, does the organization? So for access control 1, control ID 1, the description from NIST is limit system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users or devices. So we say, do you have a list of approved users, services, and devices? And do you have logical access controls in place to prevent unauthorized use of the system? And your job, the workflow in this tool, is to answer either yes or no. If yes, good. If no, then the weighted subtractor is subtracted from your overall score of 110. And in this case, access control 1.1 is worth 5 points. This weighted subtractor comes right from the methodology. There's only one of these controls where we had to do a guess on what the control was worth. I'll take you to that one here in a second. Okay, so the job is to answer yes or no and then come up with your score and report that score and the date that you expect that score to be fully 110 to the DoD. Really nothing more complicated than that, although it's a pain to get access to the SPR system, but you can use this worksheet to help perform your self-assessment. If you filter by color in the worksheet, so it might be hard to see on the Zoom, but there's like a sort of tan color and a pink color. If you filter by tan, these are the basic 17, the FAR 17 controls. These are the controls, the safeguards that we are all expected to implement, whether or not we process CUI. So all of us process some sort of federal contract information. We have to put these basic 17 safeguards in place. So there are 4 in the access control family. Do we have lists of authorized users and devices and have some sort of logical controls in place to prevent unauthorized use? Do we have logical access permissions set up in files and folder structure or in our cloud services? Do we have a list of approved connections between internal and external systems? Here's where your interconnections summary will come useful even if you're only CMMC level 1. Do you prohibit CUI from being shared on public systems? So do you have some sort of training and process in place to make sure that CUI and FCI is not published publicly? Do you require user account names and passwords to log on to your systems? Do you have a sanitization process in place? Do you understand what the requirements are for destroying or sanitizing media? And can you execute those? So that's a media protection family. Physical security has 4 controls. And the good news about these 17 is that most of us are already doing at least half of these. Like we have usernames and passwords to log onto our systems. We have door and window locks. We know who's a visitor and who's an approved person, and we escort visitors and monitor them somehow, eyes on or closed circuit camera. Most of us have a good handle on the keys and the RFID badges and the key codes that we have to use to enter our facilities. What many of us might not have, though, is a way to log all entry into our facilities that process federal contract information. And that includes authorized personnel like employees. And so if you just allow your employees to come in, but you're not actually logging when they come in, then you're not technically compliant with this control. So for a lot of us, this is going to mean, for some of us, it's going to mean we have to upgrade our current physical access control system and put in something like an RFID badge or a key code that The employee will punch in to get access to the building so that we have accountability for who's in the building at all times. All right, in the system and communications protection family, do you have firewalls? Some sort of boundary protection. Most of us do this. Publicly accessible systems. So if you maintain your web server in-house, your email server in-house, a VPN server, do you have that segregated? Do you have the systems in your architecture that are necessarily available to the public? Like you want the general public to be able to reach your web server. But those publicly available systems are also high value targets and should be either logically or physically isolated from the rest of your system into what we call a DMZ, demilitarized zone. And then in the system and information integrity, 3 of these, most of us probably already do. We probably already have antivirus installed at appropriate locations that we regularly update and regularly use. And even a basic Windows 10 workstation with nothing else on it comes with a completely sufficient antivirus program called Windows Defender that is out of the box configured to update automatically and out of the box configured to run scans at appropriate times. So we probably already do these 3. Most of us probably are not doing scanning of our network, active scanning, looking for missing operating system and software patches, as well as active scanning looking for non-hardened or unhardened devices. This is a requirement even for FCI to have some network scanning. This is a capability that most of you all are probably going to want to outsource to an IT MSP or MSSP. All right, so these are the basic 17. If we had no, for all of these, how many points would we lose? We'd already be at 47 if we're not doing the basic stuff. Okay. There's one more filter I want to show you in here. Filter by color, so I'm not going to filter by that. I'm going to filter by this pink color. There are 2 controls. So the beige color is the FAR 17. Everything else is for CUI, for CMMC level 3, including these pink colored ones. So at CMMC level 3, we have to engage multi-factor authentication. One form of authentication is a password that you provide. There are lots of other factors of authentication, but what the requirement here is that you have a password plus something else. Many of us would use like the Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator app on our phones, which generates a one-time password. That's a second factor of authentication. A CAT card or a smart card or a USB dongle like a YubiKey can also act as a second factor of authentication. You're required to have that for all access to CUI. Now, if you have some MFA implemented for remote and privileged users, but not for the general user, you would subtract 3 points. If you had no MFA implemented, you would subtract 5 points. So your job here is to choose 3 or 5. Let's say we have nothing implemented. You just type 5 there, and when you hit no, it'll subtract those points. The same is true for control 1311. If you transmit CUI external to your organization, you're required to have very specific encryption, or you're required to encrypt that CUI under very strict parameters. In fact, the encryption module has to have been vetted by the federal government through what they call the Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS, program that's run by NIST. So NIST-sponsored labs actually have to vet and test the encryption modules that are used to transmit CUI external to your organization. So it's not just the algorithms themselves, it's the actual implementation of the algorithms in the particular piece of hardware or software that you use to do the encryption. And so this will eliminate a lot of options that you have for transmitting CUI externally. Your standard HTTPS, so when you look at a URL and it has the S at the end of HTTP in the web address, it means it's secure, it means it's encrypted, but the service that's doing that encryption actually has to have been vetted by NIST if you're able to use that particular HTTPS link to transmit CUI. So your options are limited, but there are plenty of options out there for encrypting CUI properly in transit. But under your self-assessment, if you have some encryption, but it's not FIPS validated, then you would choose 3. If you have no cryptography for sending CUI externally, then you would choose 5 here and subsequent scoring. Now this last one we ourselves, Totem Technologies, has deemed worth 110 points. So what the methodology says is that if your organization does not have a system security plan, then an assessment cannot be performed. But we want you to be able to generate a score. So we just said, all right, if you don't have an SSP, you're going to subtract the entirety of the 110 points and you're going to start at 0. That's a game time decision by us. This 110 is not part of the methodology. The methodology verbatim is captured in these notes here. Okay. Yeah, that's the assessment methodology. That's the scoring system. It's a tool for you to do it. Gone through the basics of the FAR 17. Showed you the workflow in the tool. Let me make sure I didn't have anything else here. No. So any questions about the assessment methodology, use of the tool? You can find out how to report your score or we'll get you started, our knowledge base article here. Any questions there, Josh?
Looks like there aren't any questions about the assessment methodology. There is one question about, someone says, it seems like I saw on the SBA.gov website that there might be some financial help for compliance. Can you touch on that, please? Have you heard anything?
Yeah, great question. So what the DoD has said is that cost for assessment and certification will be reimbursable. Although I've only heard that in person. So the person in charge of the CMMC at the DoD side is Katie Arrington. She's, I believe, an SES appointed official now. She's at the Department of Defense, the Undersecretary of Defense Office of Acquisition. And I actually heard in March of last year, she introduced the CMMC at a workshop I was at, and she said the costs of certification will be reimbursable. But that's you hiring the C3PAO to perform the assessment and issue the certification. Elsewhere, I have heard and seen, they said security will be an allowable cost. The implementing CMMC will be an allowable cost. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that will mean there'll be a line item in the contract that says, hey, estimate how much it's going to cost to secure your entire environment as part of this contract, and then that will be part of your bid, or it's not clear what that means. Alex is saying in the chat that she said this in her workshop last week. The fact about, so Alex, I'm going to ask you back. She said the certification cost would be reimbursable, or that the entire cost of implementation is quote unquote allowable. Alex, if you can take a second and type that back in. If you go to the CMMC site itself, there's a FAQ. So let's Google DoD CMMC. And it's the acquisition osd.mil site. It will be an allowable cost as an indirect cost, not a direct cost. All right, Tom says that. So thanks, Tom. So that would mean you're adding the cost of cybersecurity program to your overhead. And Alex says certification, I believe, is going to be reimbursable. I would just want to see if they've updated these FAQ anytime soon. Let me do a refresh in case anything's cached here. How much will certification cost? Let me pop this into the chat too, so you can get to the FAQs. No help there. What if we can't afford? The cost of certification will be considered an allowable reimbursable cost and will not be prohibitive. But that's the certification. That is not the implementation. And if certification costs are anything like the cost that it costs us to get ISO 9001 or AS 9100, it'll be somewhere between, I don't know, $3,000 and $10,000. It costs us, I think it costs us $3,500 every 3 years for ISO 9001. So we could be reimbursed potentially for that certification cost, but not for the rest of the stuff. Alex says she presented at the DoD Small Business Week. So Josh, that's the extent that that's the current state of affairs with cost reimbursement.
Perfect, thank you. And we're all caught up.
Yep, great question. All right. Building an SSP, fourth topic here. How much time do we have left? Plenty of time. Plenty of time. You guys asleep yet?
No.
It's a ton of information, I know. But like I said, bite-sized chunks.
That's right.
Okay, so you have identified all of the components of your IT system, and including what you think is going to be CUI in your environment. So you've scoped the footprint of your system, and you have a good idea of what needs to be incorporated and encapsulated and covered by your SSP. And you've performed your assessment and submitted your initial assessment and submitted your score to the Department of Defense. Now, you need to start generating the primary artifacts to build your cybersecurity program and to become compliant with many of the controls in 800.171. In fact, there's a whole family of controls called security assessment that require you to maintain an SSP and a POAM. All right, so building the SSP and POAM are actually required by safeguards. So let's talk about SSP. The System Security Plan is a set of blueprints for your cybersecurity program. If we draw the analogy to a set of blueprints for a home that you're going to have constructed, the architect can construct your home, or can develop the blueprints for the home, but there are certain rules they need to follow. There's certain codes they need to abide as part of the design, right? You probably wouldn't design or at least choose a location for your house that's on the side of a cliff in an earthquake zone. Oh, we do that all the time in Ogden, Utah. Never mind. In California. Never mind. But anyway, I digress. There's certain electrical codes they have to abide. Electrical sockets have to be a certain distance off the floor. You have to use certain electrical wiring. There's best practices you would abide. For instance, we probably wouldn't have the door to the bathroom open to the outside world. It would open to the inside of the house. There's certain rules they have to abide. So we're going to craft our cybersecurity plan, our system security plan, against the 800.171 rules. And we can pick and choose more rules if we feel like they're best practices above and beyond 800.171 or CMMC level 3 with those additional 20. But let's start there. The SSP is going to contain a set of statements, policy statements, that are going to dictate the expected outcome of the implementation of that safeguard. And those policy statements should be strategically developed and strategically stated, developed by executive level staff with the rest of the organization's operations, managerial, technology in mind. So we have policy statements. So it's going to contain a set of statements. It's also going to contain a description of the technology and processes and procedures that we put in place to enforce those policies. So your SSP is policies and descriptions. You can get a lot done, or you can knock off 50% of your work in this entire cybersecurity program planning process, just creating the security policies. It's 50% of your work, and all you have to do is write stuff. You don't have to implement any technology yet. You will, but 50% of your work is just writing policies. There will be technology that is used to enforce many of those policies. So the principles of a good security policy, high-level principles here. First, that it's scalable. So is the statement simple, readable, concise, and measurable? Don't use legalese in your cybersecurity policy where you can avoid it. You want the executors, the implementers of that policy to be able to understand it, the whys, and what the expected outcomes are. Also, don't reinvent the wheel. If you already have a statement repeated in another document, then just reference that document from the SSP. So if you already have an employee handbook that has an acceptable use policy for IT stuff, and you already dictate some of the requirements for use of the system, then don't copy and paste those requirements into your SSP, just reference those requirements from your SSP. Now, you're going to want to make sure that any referenced documents are controlled documents. So they're part of a quality management system, or at a minimum, there's some file name structure and a limit on who has access to and can edit and modify those documents, what we call document control. You also don't want to paint yourself into a corner. So you want to make sure the statement does not limit technology options. So you want to keep your policy statements technology agnostic and allow the IT folks to really do trade studies and determine the best piece of technology that we can use to enforce the security policy. And you certainly don't want to hamstring yourself as far as growth and expansion. So you probably don't want to, you definitely don't want to dictate some outdated piece of technology, some 20-year-old firewall technology. It's going to limit your growth and expansion, in addition to maybe not being supported and vulnerable. So it's scalable. You also have to make sure it's going to be accessible, measurable, and accessible. I have this word auditable in here, but I'm trying to get away from using that word audit. We are going to be assessed by CMMC third-party assessment organizations. So we want to make it accessible. There are 3 methods of assessing that an assessor can use. They can interview us, interview our personnel. They can examine or inspect systems or documentation, so they can put eyes on. And they can actually test safeguards, processes, configurations, systems. It's well within their purview and their prerogative to ask for an assessor account in your IT system to verify things like your account lockout configuration actually works. So they can say, make me a user account, just like you would any normal user in your environment. I want to test. If you say that after 10 failed password attempts in 15 minutes, my account's going to be locked out, well, then I'm going to fat finger my password 10 times in a row, and I'm going to confirm that what you've attested to is true, that I actually get locked out of my account. They also might test your physical security systems. Like if you say that, well, employees have to badge in to our brick and mortar building and only through this particular door, then they might go test the other doors and make sure they can't get in the building. And they're certainly going to examine your SSP, and they're definitely going to interview personnel. So you need to make sure your personnel are coached up before these assessors arrive on site. Anyway, these are principles of good security policy. So let's look at some example security policies. Control 3.10.6. This is in the physical protection family, I believe, 310, and the sixth control. It requires us to enforce safeguarding measures for CUI at alternate work sites. And it has two, what you can think of as sub-controls, but we call these organizational actions. NIST calls them assessment objectives. There's A and B. One requires us to define safeguarding measures for CUI. The other requires us to enforce those defined safeguarding measures. So you're looking for, as you develop your system security plan, you're looking for keywords. A keyword like defined, identified, listed. Those are the three that are coming to the top of my head. Those are good indications that you're going to address that safeguard through a policy statement. Keywords like implemented, enforced, prohibited, proscribed, those types of action words are good indications that you're going to, in your system security plan, address this safeguard through a description of the technology or procedures that you have in place to do that enforcement. All right, alternate work sites. The discussion from 800-171, so in the 800-171 document, there's actually some supplemental guidance and a little bit more information on what the spirit is behind many of these controls. It says alternate work sites may include, for example, government facilities or private residences of employees. Hey, most of us on this call right now are working from home, me included. So I'm at an alternate work site. When I'm doing work for Hate Bay or Totem.tech, I'm doing it from an alternate work site right now. Organizations may define different security requirements for specific alternate work sites or types of sites depending on the work-related activities conducted. And then it references a couple of other NIST guides for enterprise and user security when teleworking. Okay, so alternate work sites are like our work from home environment. Well, let's look at how we might address these controls in our system security plan. And bear in mind, these are just example, maybe suggested policies. These are not, this is not meant for you to take and run with this exact policy and say, hey, Totem Tech said this is what we have to do for alternate work site. This is an example, okay? We feel like it's a good example, but you got to take all this stuff with a grain of salt and customize it for your environment. So 3.10.6a, safeguard measures are defined. Here's a potential definition. Employees may work from home or other remote locations, but shall. So you see shall, right? So we're putting like official requirements type language in here, expectations. Shall only process company information from a company provided workstation. This type of remote work shall be authorized by the employee's supervisor. Remote employees shall only connect to the company network through company hosted VPN. Remote employees shall only establish remote VPN connections through secured internet connections, such as password protected home networks, and never using open or public wireless access points. All right. Alternately, let's say you already have your work from home requirements dictated in an employee handbook or acceptable use policy. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't regurgitate them. Just reference that policy from your SSP. So if we already had them in company AUP Rev 1 doc, then we would just reference that. By the way, anybody have an idea of why we suggest prohibiting your remote work employees from using open or public wireless access points? So in other words, why we suggest, I'm asking you all this question, why we suggest that you don't allow remote work from like Starbucks Wi-Fi or the Costco Wi-Fi. Let's see, we're getting any answers in here. It's most vulnerable. It may not be encrypted. Avoid the man in the middle attacks. Right. So it may not be encrypted, first of all, and you don't want to be transmitting any kind of sensitive information over an unencrypted link. It probably is, but it may not be. You also have no idea who else is on that network. You control nothing about that network. So as Bryant says, there could be some bad actor on that same network just waiting for sucker you to attach to that network. And now they're sniffing all the network traffic, especially if it's unencrypted. They have a copy of it all. They know information about your machine. They know information about connections that you're making. Whoa, Matthew goes handshake package grabbing. Matt, you dove right way in the deep end. I got to keep it a little bit higher level. I was going to make a comment on that too, but it's not safe for work.
Quick question for you, Adam.
Yeah.
Someone asks if the government is going to have programs that will try to hack, like kind of white hat hacking outside of audits to test the systems.
Yeah, so what they're talking about is penetration testing. I think what they're asking about is penetration testing. I highly doubt that as part of the DIB assessments, the defense industrial base assessments, that they will be doing penetration testing, any kind of real penetration testing. They may run vulnerability scanners on your network, but that's not the same thing as penetration testing. And don't let anybody tell you that, by the way. There's a lot of snake oil salesmen in our industry that'll pass off a simple vulnerability scan. So they'll just throw a really simple tool at your company website and see if they can find any vulnerabilities. That is different than penetration testing. Penetration testing is an art and requires highly skilled individuals and maybe even teams of individuals, significant amounts of time to execute properly. And there are limited numbers of those skilled individuals in the workforce currently, and I doubt they're going to recruit many of those into the CMMC third-party assessment organizations as part of this assessment. But I don't know. Maybe, I just doubt it. What they'll probably just do is run vulnerability scans. Anything else, Josh?
Nope. Thank you.
Okay, great question. All right, so that was the security policy statement for A, 310.6A. Now we're looking at 310.6B, which requires us to describe how we're enforcing those safeguarding measures. So we say employees authorized for remote work are given company-provided workstations. Prior to connecting to the VPN, these employees are required to submit to the company IT administrators the IP address of the network they're attempting connection from. The VPN, established by the company gateway firewall, filters VPN connection attempts by MAC and IP address and only allows company-owned machines to connect from authorized external networks. See the attached screenshot showing the VPN connection filter configuration. So we have a robust yet technology agnostic description of the enforcement mechanism. We also are being upfront and providing as much compelling evidence that this is actually configured the way we say it is, because we're saying, hey, see this screenshot. So the more that you can give the assessors upfront and that they don't have to ask for this, what we call compelling evidence of enforcement, the more that you can give them, the easier your job is going to be. So do things like take screenshots, do report dumps from your RMM tools that show your list of hardware and software, and have them ready to go to hand off to the assessors. This can mean a lot of electronic files that you may have to manage. God forbid they ask us for paper copies of all this stuff. I hope we don't have to cut down that many trees to have us all have our system security plans as paper copies for these assessments, but you never know. But it can end up being lots of documentation that you have to manage. In fact, it probably will be several dozen what we call artifacts that you have to manage as part of this process. Okay, So that is an example of a separate policy statement and a separate technology description statement. Some of these controls actually require a mix of the two, what we call a hybrid approach. A good example of this is 3.1.17. So this is in the access control family. And B, the B assessment objective or action here is that wireless access to the system is protected using encryption. So our statement here is both a statement of policy and a description of technology enforcement. Wireless access to the company IT system shall only be available through company-controlled wireless access points. WAPs shall be configured to require passwords and transmit using the Wi-Fi protected access protocol, engaging AES encryption. WEP and WPS shall be disabled. Those are extremely insecure Wi-Fi setup, so those shall be disabled. The company has, so that's the policy statement, right? Here's a description of the enforcement. The company has 2 password protected WAPs meshed together to provide common authentication. WPA2 is engaged, WEP and WPS is disabled. See the attached screenshot, which shows the security configuration settings of the WAPs. All right, so this is a policy and technological description in one, or addressing a single action item. All right, example security policy. So those are some examples. It is your task to develop a system security plan and address each of the NIST 800-171 requirements in your system security plan. Like I said, there is an SSP template that you can use from NIST. Unfortunately, this template does not list all of the individual assessment objectives that you are going to be responsible for proving that you've implemented. So you can find all those assessment objectives if you Google NIST 800-171A. This is the assessment guide for 800-171. It's a NIST special publication. If we open this, I'll pop this in the chat. Let me make sure I'm chatting everyone here. The handshake package grabbing. All right, so under each control in here, I just jumped right to 3.8, which is the media protection family 3.8.2. The control is listed. And then for this one, they have one assessment objective. So determine if access to CUI and system media is limited to authorized users. The better example is probably 3.8.1, where there are 4 different assessment objectives for 3.8.1. So you can find all of these in NIST 800-171A. Like I said, our tool, we expand all of these controls and show the assessment objectives in here. I'm not here to sell this tool. There are other tools that do the same thing. I just don't find what NIST gives you in their templates particularly satisfying or particularly useful. Some of you may already have this stuff done and you're satisfied with it. That's all good. All right, so we have 45 minutes left. We've taken 2 breaks. Josh, what I'd like to do is take another 10-minute break and then wrap up with the incident response planning stuff. Does that work?
Great. Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So let's say 25 after again.
Yep.
Does that work?
That sounds great.
Okay, right on, perfect. We'll be back at 25 after, thanks. All right, Josh, I'm back whenever you're ready.
Perfect, let's go ahead and continue.
All right, right on. Welcome back. So we've got half an hour left, a little bit over half an hour, and we are gonna wrap things up with the second of the 2 overriding requirements in the DFAR 7012. And that second requirement is incident response capability, essentially, and being able to report incidents to the DoD. So the first requirement is that we provide this adequate protection, adequate security for the CUI. And the second major requirement is that we recognize incidents related to that CUI and report those to the DoD. Not for punitive reasons. They're not interested in punishing us for allowing the cybersecurity incident. Cybersecurity incidents are going to happen no matter what. They want to know about them so that they can see if they are systemic and address them systemically, and then B, publish indicators of compromise, indicators of incidents to their community at large to help us protect ourselves. So we're required to do this reporting. Let's start with the reporting piece first, and then we will jump into the basics of an incident response plan and capability. So you're required to report incidents, and we'll define an incident here in a second. You're required to report an incident to the DoD through a portal that they manage. And I'll take you to this portal here in a bit. In order to get access, in order to authenticate your organization and yourself to that portal, you actually have to procure a certificate from a vendor that allows you to authenticate yourself. So those certificates are purchased from one of two vendors at ADISA. That's the Department of Defense Information Systems Agency website. So let's just go. They're in general, some general information about them. They're about $100 a year, a little bit more if you get them installed on a smart card or USB stick. And you actually have to apply for a certificate by mailing a notarized letter, snail mail, to this Department of Defense vetting agency to sort of vet that you're a legitimate US-based, you're a United States corporation with US citizens, blah, blah, blah. So it takes a little while. We've had it take a week for clients. And by the way, if you have a CAT card within your organization, you can actually use the CAT card, CAT card to log in instead of the certificate. But most of you will not have a CAT card associated with your program, so you'll need to procure one of these certificates. So we go to public.cyber.mil. This is the DISA cybersecurity clearinghouse knowledge base, a whole bunch of stuff here. But under the PKI, PKE, we see external certificate authorities. There are two approved vendors. It might be a little bit hard to see these guys right here on Zoom, but WidePoint and IdentiTrust. The process for procuring the certificate is virtually identical through either of these vendors, and the cost is identical as well. It doesn't really matter. I happen to like IdentiTrust website a little bit better. So I'll take you through the basics of this. You go to their website, you want to buy now. It gives you a range of options of types of ECA programs that you need your certificate for. What your organization may also do work with the State Department. So you might already have a certificate for the Department of State, but what you must have is this Defense Industrial Based Cybersecurity Program certificate. I'm just making sure they haven't changed the name of anything here. Yeah, so you need this DIB Cybersecurity Program certificate. So get rid of this little message. Hit next. Yep, I live in the US. All right, so what you need is what you're gonna get is a medium assurance certificate. The question is whether or not you get that sent to you as an electronic file that you install on a particular workstation, or whether you have that certificate installed on a token, so either a smart card or USB stick, and that means you can move that token around to different workstations, so you could do your reporting from essentially any workstation in your environment. Let's just say you want it on a USB stick. Go with the 3-year option, and I want it on a USB token. That's an additional $68 for that token. Go to next, and by now, and you're going to go through the process of application. This is where I'm going to stop. But the application process is pretty straightforward. And like I said, ultimately you're going to print out a form, have that form notarized, and then you're going to snail mail that into, I think it's some agency at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, the last time I checked. And then they'll either send you your smart card or USB by mail or email you a certificate, electronic file. So that's the process for obtaining the certificate. We have step-by-step instructions in our knowledge base. Let's see here. Somewhere in here. How to obtain an ECA certificate for incident reporting. So it leads you to a blog. I'll share this link with everybody. All right, so that's that process. Let's talk about incidents themselves, though. What is an incident? Well, there's a sort of hierarchy or ecosystem of stuff that happens on, in a computer environment that may lead up to being able to determine whether or not it's an incident or not. So you have events, what we call events. Oops. Need my laser pointer. You have events. There are, on any given IT network, any given IT component system, there are hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of events generated in a given day. This is any observable occurrence. So a log on, you logging on to your workstation can create an event. And you're actually required by 800.171 to define certain events that will actually generate a log, a little text file, and collect those logs and analyze those logs. If a log indicates an anomaly, some weird occurrence, some unexpected occurrence in your computer ecosystem, then you want to have some process by which an alert is generated so that a human or some sort of AI can go investigate that anomaly and determine if it's worthy of response. So alerts are usually events that have some sort of security context and may or may not constitute an incident. In the audit and accountability family in 800.171, there's 8 or 9, I think 9 or 10 controls, and the summation of all those controls in that family require you as an organization to collect events of interest, correlate and collect those events and correlate and analyze them in a central repository, a central tool. We call that type of tool a SIEM, S-I-E-M, Security Information and Event Management Tool. Have that tool be tuned and configured to generate alerts for anomalies, and then have a human in the loop that will investigate those alerts and determine if there's an incident, which if there is, it would spark your incident response capability. So earlier we talked about the capability that most of us are weakest in and that we will most often be looking to outsource. It is that entire capability that I just described. We're probably going to want to outsource that capability. Some of the alerts, some of the anomalies will actually be incidents. An incident, the rule of thumb for an incident is, did a security policy or control or safeguard or best practice fail in some manner? If the answer is yes, you have an incident on your hands. Or if there's an imminent potential that a security control is going to fail, you have an incident on your hands and you need to respond to it. You need to stop the bleeding. If that incident is, if the incident occurs on or around your covered contractor information system, so essentially if it involves anything that processes, stores, transmits, or protects CUI, or involves the CUI itself, you have to report that incident to the DoD through that through the portal, which I haven't taken you to yet. I need to take you to the portal. If you suspect or confirm that an adversary had definite access to that CUI, then you would categorize the incident as a breach. A lot of organizations will use the terms incident and breach interchangeably. I'm getting a little pedantic and I'm saying they're not interchangeable. An incident is one thing, a breach is a separate thing. All breaches are incidents, but not all incidents are breaches. All right, I forgot to take you to the portal. So let me do that. If you go to dibnet.dod.mil, this is where you report incidents to the DoD. So in order to report a cyber incident, you have to have a certificate. It's not going to let me in because I don't have my certificate. I don't have my CAT card installed right now. So it is every member of the Defense Industrial Base, every member of the DoD supply chain that process CUI, it is your individual organization's responsibility to procure a certificate to be able to report cyber incidents directly to the DoD. You do not report them to the prime contractor, you report them to the DoD itself. And then you'll get a little incident number that you hand off to your prime contractor, to the program manager or whoever. This means even as the lowliest not low, that's the wrong word. Even as the powder coating shop or lathe shop that's 10 tiers down in Lockheed Martin's supply chain, you have to have certain information to be able to do this DoD incident report. The information you need to gather is listed here under this for DoD contractors reporting cyber incidents. Let me put this link to the portal in the chat so you guys have this. You need obvious things like company name, point of contact. You also need your DUNS number. You need a cage code. If you don't have those yet, you need to procure them. If you don't have them, I'm surprised you're part of the supply chain, but either way. You also need some information that may take you some digging. You need the contracting officers and program manager's name and point of contact information. And this is the person at the DoD, not at the prime contractor. This is a US government person, either military or civilian, but in a government seat. So it may take some digging to extract this information from your prime contractor. So you need to get working on this because you have to have this at time of reporting. And then other obvious stuff like, well, what systems are involved? What's the type of compromise? A narrative on the incident, what's the outcome, any additional information. So there's 20 sort of data elements here that you need to gather to be able to report an incident. All right, back to the slideshow. Let's give an example of an incident, a reportable incident. So your organization's server generates an event that indicates a failed logon for an administrator account. Not necessarily anomalous, but you've configured that server to generate a little text file and that's sent to your SIM server. The SIM, however, creates an alert because it's tuned to generate an alert for failed logons that come after hours. So this one happened to come at 3 a.m. Administrators normally aren't working at 3 a.m. in your particular organization or at this particular organization. So humans start investigating the alert. The security ops team realizes multiple failed logons to multiple different machines occurred around the same time, originating from a single workstation in the engineering department. And that workstation also had inbound connections to it from an IP address outside the organization. As Scooby-Doo would say, ruh-roh. A workstation having an inbound connection from outside, an ongoing inbound connection is usually not a good sign, especially at 3 a.m. in the morning. Security operations team classifies the circumstance as an incident. Somewhere along the line, a security control failed that led to this scenario. So it's an incident. We need to begin incident response. Part of that response is to isolate the workstation from the network. Why do you think they want to isolate the workstation from the network? This is a question I posed to you all. First one in gets a virtual fist bump, or we got to do elbow bumps now in COVID. Why would you want to isolate this workstation from the network? That's a question I pose to you all. Is anyone awake? Can you hear me? Stop the bleeding. To stop the bleeding, to stop the spread, potentially stop the exfiltration of information. Yeah, Jeff, you get the virtual elbow bump, buddy. Jeffrey, sorry. Yeah, the first thing to do is contain the problem, stop the bleeding. You cut yourself with a knife, you don't worry about, well, why did I use the knife that way? You worry about, well, let me stop the bleeding, right? So, and then they determined that the workstation was infected with malware, which allowed an adversary a persistent remote connection, command and control type of connection. Also, that the workstation housed engineering data considered controlled defense information, therefore CUI. Classifies the incidents as a breach because the adversary potentially had access to that. CDI, after containing the incident, determining exactly what may have been compromised, the organization files an incident report with the DoD. Once you recognize an incident that may involve CUI or your covered system, you have 72 hours to report that incident to the DoD. So the clock starts ticking. So in parallel with incident response, you need to be gathering and archiving information about the incident that you can report, that you'll have to report to the DoD. All right, 72 hours to report the incident. Okay, so at Totem, we're advocates of because of our partnership with GuardSite, we're advocates of the pickerel model of incident response planning. So there are phases to incident response. You may not necessarily execute these phases in order, but at some point, all incident response will involve all 6 of these phases. Pickerel is an acronym for prepare for the incident, identify the incident, contain it, eradicate, recover, eradicate the problem, or recover, return to normal operations. And then when the dust is settled a little bit, do a brain dump, lessons learned, after action reports, look for opportunities for improvement to help prepare better for the next one. So this actually could look like a big cycle, right? Your lessons learned directly influence how you prepare for the next incident. So I'm just trying to think, with 15 minutes left, if I want to go through these slides, or what I'd rather do is jump to this slide, and then I'm going to pop into the tool that we provide you as part of this workshop. So there are a ton of fantastic incident response resources out there to help you generate the incident response plan, which you are required to have by 800-171. Help generate and exercise your incident response plan. There's a really awesome GitHub repository by this user named Meyerwa. It's got a ton of good stuff in that repository, and then these are individual links with some costs for resources that'll help you do things like preparation, identification, containment, things called playbooks, which I'll expose you. If I have time, I'll expose you to one or more playbooks here. But in general, I just wanted to show you this incident response resource guide. This is some links of very many that you can use to help you prepare your incident response plan. But what we've done is provided you with a tool, an actual incident response plan template. Full disclosure, I think I mentioned this before, this is MIT licensed by GuardSite, so the framework of this plan actually comes from our GuardSite partners. We've embellished it a little bit and then added 2 things, added some information that you'll need specifically in a DoD environment. So let me scroll down through. All right, some general introductory information here. Descriptions, taxonomy of what constitutes an event, alert, incident. We've gone over that on the previous slide, example of an incident. And then instructions for how to use this guide. A reiteration that Containment, stopping the bleeding, is the most important course of action during an incident. And then we get into sections that are based off of the Pickrell model, so a section for each phase of response. So we have sections where you'll capture your information security officer's information. You're not required to have somebody with the title of information security officer at your organization, but you definitely are required to have somebody that will act in that role. A single point of contact for security operations within the organization. And it would be very hard to outsource this capability, by the way. So in your especially small organizations, some of you might have to wear this hat in addition to your quality management rep hat or your CEO hat. All right. So capture contact information for this person. And then that person will also engage a team, both consisting of internal and maybe external folks. So you want to identify all those individuals. I'm going to sort of scoot down here through here in the interest of time. You're required by 800-171 to identify some recovery metrics as part of incident response. So just in a nutshell, 3 recovery metrics you want to look at: maximum tolerable downtime, recovery time objective, and recovery point objective. Maximum tolerable downtime: how long can your organization be without the IT capability? How much RPO is how much data can the organization withstand to lose? And then RTO is how long does it take to restore that IT system to a point where you can start reemplacing the missing or the backed up data. You're required to identify metrics like these. So we give you a placeholder in your incident response plan. It's a good idea for the incident response team to understand how long they have to fix the problem. Who needs to be notified of an incident internally? And then a place to capture all the information for your incident reporting to the DoD. So place for your DUNS number, contract officers information, program managers information, cage code, so on and so forth. Now, it is a really good idea, once you have your IRP squared away, at least the first cut of it, to store this document in locations external to your main brick and mortar facility or off of your main server. So to have copies of this document on your security officer's desktop or laptop, or maybe back a copy of this up into your cloud service. It's a really good idea. Some of you guys are already guessing why. I'd ask the question to you, but I'm running out of time. It's a good idea because what if the server, your file server, on-premise file server, is compromised as part of the incident? Maybe it's locked up with ransomware. You can't get to it. If you can't get to your server and your only copy of your incident response plan is stored on your server, then you're up the proverbial creek. So you got to have, it's a good idea to have separate copies of this laying around. Okay. In each of these sections, so identify, contain, eradicate, recover, we have general principles. We also have a section where you can capture organizational specific principles, procedures, processes, and all this stuff where we suggest you go make sure that you have some specific processes and procedures captured is highlighted in yellow here. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all incident response plan. Earlier in my career, I was very hesitant to even hand out a template for an incident response because I have seen these things just taken boilerplate, face value, and put on a shelf and never customized for an environment. So like the organization, with this template, it would be as if you just took this document, entered it into document control, and didn't go customize any of this yellow highlighted stuff. And that's almost even worse than having no incident response plan at all. A useless incident response plan just wastes time trying to figure out if there's anything of value in it. you might as well not have an incident response plan. At least you're not wasting time reading useless documents. So I caution you, if you were going to take this as a template, you have to put some work into it to customize it for your environment. Yeah, so these are the various sections and the highlighted areas in here. I'm just going to sort of breeze through here. Get down to the contain. Containment is the most important course of action. You may draw from several resources to execute containment. We have a computer security incident response aid pamphlet, and let me make sure I have that in the share file. Password manager for the win. If I don't have it in there, I'll add it in. I do. A computer incident response aid pamphlet. It's a really short 2-side pamphlet with a list of suggested user level responses to an incident. Okay, so you can download that from the share file. So user level responses, this is like day-to-day users. What are they supposed to do in an incident? You can have a table full of containment activities and procedures. This is a boilerplate template or boilerplate table. Don't take this verbatim. You got to make sure this all works in your environment. You can also use what are called playbooks. So here's an example of incidentresponse.com's playbooks, or here's a link to it. We also, in our knowledge base, GuardSite has introduced what they call playbook battle cards. And so they have a GitHub repository with these playbook battle cards. So let's take a look at one of these. So exfiltration, let's just look at this guy. We will download this. So it's a set of general instructions for what to do to prepare, identify, contain, eradicate, recover from, and lessons learned for automated exfiltration of data out of your environment. So if you don't feel up to the task, or maybe it's redundant to try to capture all of the possible incident containment procedures in a table like this in your IRP, it's going to make it IRP too long, then reference to external playbooks. Where you have references to websites in your incident response plan, I highly suggest that you have them spelled out. Don't just have links, have the actual URL listed in case you have this incident response plan printed on paper copy. You're not able to click a link on a paper copy. So containment, instructions for eradication and remediation, a place to contain your instructions for recovery and restoration, and then general guidances on how to conduct after action reviews and lessons learned meetings. Like I said, after the dust settles, you want to do this to make improvements to your plan. You want to get everybody that was involved in the incident together and do a little brain dump. Last but not least, you are required to test, I prefer the word exercise. You're required to exercise your incident response plan against realistic scenarios. In that link of that IR resources link in the slideshow, we had some links to, or in one of the slides, we have some links to a NIST publication as well as a SANS publication that give you some realistic scenarios against which to exercise your incident response plan. A fantastic scenario that everybody should at least exercise their IRP against once is ransomware. So you come in on a Monday morning and everybody's computer has a big red skull and crossbones on the screen, and it says, computer, your system's locked up, pay us a Bitcoin to unlock it. What do? Make sure, exercise, get everybody together, have around a table, we call it tabletop exercise. Brainstorm about what you would do. Reference your incident response plan. See if it contains procedures that will help you through this situation. And if it doesn't, then improve your plan. And then document the date and scenario used and summary and lessons learned from each exercise. Also, each live fire actual incident you want to document here as well. This is your piece of compelling evidence to your assessor that you're actually testing this incident response plan. Okay, a little bit of a hustle there at the end. I prefer looking at the actual plan template itself anyway to looking at these slides. So you can go back and cruise through the incident response aspect of this slide deck if you like. All right, I'm going to wrap up and then give a few minutes for questions. I do want to let you know that if you email info@totem.tech, we have an ebook that expands on all of these concepts and more that we talked about during this workshop. And we usually charge $49 for it, but for Utah PTAC clients, we'll give it to you for free. Just hit us up with an email and the subject line free ebook to info@totem.tech. And that is it. So our contact information is here. This is our marketing and outreach team. This is me, Adam. That is my time. I thank you very much for all of your time, and I thank Chuck and his awesome staff at Utah PTAC for the opportunity. I'm happy to stick around. We've got a couple more minutes, but I'm happy to stick around even a few minutes after that to answer any questions.
Thank you. I just see two right now. First one is that incident reporting, that's part of both level 1 and level 3, correct?
Incorrect. Only for level 3.
Okay.
Only for CUI. Great question. I should have clarified that.
And then the second question is a little bit long, so I'm just going to paste it in the chat box so that you can.
What's the correlation to the NIST standards? Is there a specific number of complied with sections that meet the requirements as there are with FAR? If the business has met 31 basic NIST standards completed and have an MLOA, are they compliant? And then somebody asked about the slide for the ebook. There's the ebook slide. DFAR 7012 compliance calls out that you fully implement the 110 safeguards in NIST 800-171. So that's the correlation. DFARs will be updated at some point in the future to call out CMMC instead of NIST 800-171. And if you recall, CMMC level 3 encapsulates all of the 800-171 requirements in an additional 20. The rest of this question, if a business has met 31 basic NIST standards, completed a self-risk assessment, are they compliant? So to be compliant with the current DFARS, you must have an SSP that addresses NIST 800-171 in its entirety. You must have a plan of action and milestones, so a corrective action plan by which you plan on fully implementing all of those policies in your SSP, and you must have an incident response plan. That's what you need.
Perfect. Chuck, I'm going to turn the time back over. Oh, we have one more. How do we run such a training scenario, such as ransomware? We don't want to actually infect anything. Is it enough to just put a picture up on people's desktop, or is there some more sophisticated level of tool available for running it?
Oh yeah, you don't even have to put the picture up. You can just brainstorm. You can just do a thought experiment. So my suggestion is to the person that you've identified as the security officer, they determine who internally and externally would be part of incident response, gather them either physically, literally around a table, or get a virtual conference going on Zoom, and have that security officer pose that question. We come in, CEO comes in on Monday morning, big red skull and crossbones. What do we do? Go. And then just open it up for discussion. You don't even have to literally do anything. You just have that discussion.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, I'm going to turn the time back over to you, Chuck.
Okay, Joshua, am I unmuted?
Yes.
We can
Okay,
hear you.
very good. Well, I don't know about how the rest of you feel, but that was about the fastest 4 hours that I can remember in a long time. Adam, you have done a fantastic job dealing with a very complex subject matter of Department of Defense cybersecurity and CMMC. So I wanted to give you some feedback, Adam. I've received some recent emails in the last hour, and they've all been very, very positive, and they have said that you have covered exactly what they needed to hear and to address. So our hats off to you, and thank you for your time and your preparation. Well done.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. And we're in the same boat, so I'm just trying to help us all stay
Yes.
above water.
Thank you. I want everyone to know that you're welcome to contact Adam at Totem Technologies. But in front of the screen, you see a slide on the PTAC side. Our lead guy, our expert in cybersecurity and CMMC is Thomas Skirke. He's our PTAC regional manager, and he offices typically out of Orem, Utah, and Utah County. So if you have questions about what you heard from Adam today, or if you have questions about how you proceed going forward, contact Adam at that email address or his work phone number. Like everyone else, he's working primarily from home. But if you were to contact him, he would set up a virtual meeting, or even perhaps, if needed, a meeting in his office as we social distance. So again, Thomas Skirke, there is his information. One last thing before I end, just a little bit of a shameless plug. I'm going to hold this up. This is our flyer for our next outreach conference, which is our symposium. It's our procurement opportunities preview, and it's going to be held on October 15th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we have, as of today, we have lined up over 26 presenters with business opportunities from their respective organizations that you're going to hear from. We have quite a few that have already registered, but for those of you on this Zoom meeting that haven't, we encourage you to go and register. The cost, there's no cost, it's free of charge. Go to our website, business.utah.gov/PTAC, and go to events, and then just go ahead and click on October 15th and register. So like I said, that is our next event, again, October 15th, and we won't have any more other than maybe some Gavology webinars between now and then. So we'll bid you adieu, and we'll look forward to seeing and hearing from all of you on October 15th. Thank you.